Hello, sleepy historians. Welcome. Tonight we gently drift back to ancient Egypt, exploring their fears, curses, and afterlife anxieties. Ready to doze off to history? Please take a moment now to like and subscribe if you enjoy this. It helps so much. Now, settle in. Where are you joining us from and what time is it there? Let the quiet drone begin, preparing you for rest as we explore ancient worries together. Close your eyes. Okay, let's settle deeper into the quiet landscape of ancient Egypt. Imagine the Nile, lifeblood of a civilization, but casting long shadows are the monuments, not just to kings, but to death itself. Vast pyramids piercing the endless sky, colossal temples aligned with distant stars, hidden tombs carved deep into the valley rock. Generations upon generations labored. Immense resources poured like water into building these eternal homes for the departed, stone upon stone, a quiet testament to an unwavering focus, a society seemingly defined by what happens after life ceases, a landscape shaped by the quiet pursuit of permanence against the slow, inevitable decay. Inside these silent structures, intricate preparations unfolded with solemn routine, bodies preserved with meticulous care, organs removed and stored, placed carefully in canopic jars, the vessel then wrapped in endless linen strips, layer upon layer, the slow process of mummification, a complex, lengthy ritual believed absolutely essential for the soul's long journey into the Duat. Tombs were carefully filled with necessary possessions, familiar furniture, preserved food, quiet games, essential tools, even full-sized boats for navigating the underworld's dark rivers. Yet, beneath this elaborate facade, this monumental striving for control over eternity, lay a quiet current of deep unease. Why such immense, back-breaking effort? Why the perceived need for potent spells, protective amulets, and those fearsome curses we often hear about, guarding the tomb's entrance? It speaks not just of hope for eternal life, but perhaps of profound anxiety, a deep fear of the journey's countless dangers, a fear of oblivion, a fear that the deceased might simply be forgotten, or worse, fail the final judgment before Osiris. This careful preparation also reveals a society wrestling with the terrifying unknown, the fragility of existence, even in their meticulously planned afterlife. Okay, let's gently explore the core ideas behind Egypt's focus on the afterlife. It helps explain the tombs, the mummies, and the spells we'll touch upon later. So we see the immense effort, the tombs, the rituals. But why? What was the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife? It wasn't just about survival, it was about transforming, continuing existence. Their concept of the soul was complex, not a single entity, but several distinct parts, each with its own needs, its own role in the journey. Understanding these components, the ka, the ba, is key to understanding their preparations and perhaps their anxieties. First, the ka, often called the life force or spiritual double. Created with the body, it animated the person during life. Crucially, the ka continued after death but still needed sustenance. Much like a living person requires food and drink, it required offerings. This is why tombs held not just perishable items like real food and drink, but also detailed paintings and models of provisions, representing eternal sustenance for the ka's ongoing needs, ensuring it wouldn't weaken or starve in the afterlife. Then there was the ba. This is perhaps closer to our concept of personality or unique character, representing everything non-physical that made an individual who they were. The ba was often depicted in art as a bird, usually with a human head, symbolizing its innate mobility. After death, the ba could travel, leaving the tomb during the day, perhaps visiting familiar spots in the world of the living, or journeying through the mysterious underworld. However, the ba had to return each night. It needed to reunite with the physical body, or at least an accurate representation like a statue. This necessity explains the critical importance of mummification, preserving the body as a permanent, recognizable anchor for the returning ba. Next, we have the akh. This represents the ultimate desired state, the transfigured spirit, the effective, blessed deceased, who had successfully navigated all the trials of the afterlife. The akh was believed to form after death, specifically after the ka and ba were successfully reunited within the tomb, and after the deceased passed the final judgment before the gods. It was the akh that could dwell eternally in the Egyptian paradise, the field of reeds. Becoming an akh was the ultimate goal, achieving a state of blessed effectiveness and power. It required the other spiritual parts be properly maintained, and that the deceased be judged worthy through their actions in life. And the destination? This ultimate goal? The field of reeds, known as Auru in the ancient Egyptian language. This was envisioned as an eternal paradise, a perfect, idealized reflection of the fertile Nile valley they knew so well, but crucially without any hardship, sickness, or sorrow. Here, the deceased, now transformed into an Akh, would live on in perpetual bliss, cultivating eternally fertile fields, enjoying endless food and drink, essentially living an idealized version of earthly Egyptian life. But entry required passing the crucial weighing of the heart ceremony, judged by the god Osiris, where the deceased's heart was weighed against the single feather of Ma'at, the goddess representing truth and justice. Only a heart light and free from sin granted passage to Aru. So the connections become clearer now. The Ka needed nourishment, hence the endless offerings and tomb depictions. The Ba needed a physical anchor to return to each night, hence the elaborate process of mummification and the placement of statues. The Akh was a desired final, transfigured state, achieved only through the reunion of Ka and Ba and, crucially, passing judgment. The field of reeds was the lush paradise awaiting the worthy Akh. All these distinct elements, Ka, Ba, Akh, judgment, Araru, formed the complex theological framework driving the ancient Egyptians' meticulous, almost obsessive preparations for death. It was a system designed to ensure not just survival, but transformation and eternal peace, a system whose very complexity perhaps hints at their deep underlying fear of failure. Okay, we've outlined the Egyptian ideal for the afterlife, the Ka, the Ba, the Akh, and the peaceful field of reeds. It sounds quite organized, almost reassuring in its detail. But beneath the surface of these intricate beliefs and the monumental efforts we see lurked significant anxiety. What if something went wrong? What if the carefully laid plans failed? This wasn't just a vague worry. They had specific fears, concrete reasons to be deeply anxious about their journey into the afterlife and their continued existence within it. One of the most immediate and depressingly common fears was simple tomb robbery. Imagine spending years and immense wealth preparing your eternal home, filling it with everything deemed necessary for your Ka and Ba, only for thieves to break in shortly after your burial, seeking valuables. This wasn't a rare occurrence. It was rampant throughout much of Egyptian history, despite increasingly hidden entrances and protective warning. It was a fear grounded firmly in reality, the violation of one's final sacred resting place. For the consequences of robbery were potentially dire, extending far beyond the mere loss of gold or precious objects. Intruding robbers might damage or even destroy the mummy itself, leaving the Ga without its essential physical anchor, unable to return each night, potentially becoming lost forever. They would steal the food offerings and provisions, leaving the Ga to metaphorically starve or weaken. They might damage the crucial inscriptions, but the spells needed for safe passage through the Duat. Tomb robbery wasn't just theft. It was perceived as a direct attack on the deceased's very chance at achieving eternity, a potential shattering of their carefully constructed afterlife. Another profound fear was having one's name deliberately erased. To the ancient Egyptians, the name, which they called the Ren, was a vital part of identity, intrinsic to existence itself, both in life and after death. To speak someone's name was thought to help keep them alive in memory, and thus assist their continued existence in spirit. If your name was intentionally chiseled off monuments, hacked out from tomb walls, a practice sometimes employed against enemies or disgraced figures, known later as damnatio memoriae, it was seen as an attempt to wipe you from existence entirely, both in this world and, terrifyingly, the next. A chilling prospect, akin to being utterly forgotten, effectively ceasing to be. And then there was the persistent anxiety about continued sustenance for the Ka. As we noted, the Ka needed offerings perpetually. While tombs contained initial supplies, the ideal scenario involved living descendants or dedicated mortuary priests funded by an endowment, continuing to provide food and drink offerings at the tomb chapel, indefinitely, generation after generation. But what if your family line eventually died out? What if your endowment for a priest ran out of funds centuries later, or was simply neglected and forgotten? The Ka could weaken, fade, suffer. This fear placed the deceased's well-being partly in the hands and memories of the living, far into the future. Even if the tomb remained perfectly secure, and the name was remembered, and the offering somehow continued, there remained the great hurdle, the final judgment before Osiris. the weighing of the heart. What if, despite your best efforts and intentions in life, your heart proved heavy upon the scales, weighed down by misdeeds, ignorance, or impurity, judged unworthy by the gods? The fear of failing this ultimate cosmic test, of being found wanting at the most crucial moment, must have been a deep source of unease. Failure meant denial of entry into the peaceful paradise of the field of reeds. And failure at this judgment didn't just mean being turned away from paradise like a closed gate. It led directly to the most terrifying prospect of all in the Egyptian mindset, the second death. This wasn't merely dying physically, which was a natural transition. The second death meant complete and utter annihilation. The unworthy heart and the consciousness, the soul associated with it, would be immediately devoured by the terrifying goddess Amit, a monstrous chimera, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, waiting patiently by the scales. To be eaten by Amit meant oblivion, the absolute end of consciousness, ceasing to exist entirely. This was arguably the ultimate Egyptian horror. And even for those deemed worthy, the journey to the judgment hall and then onward to the field of reeds was itself fraught with peril. The underworld, the Duat, was not envisioned as a pleasant place to travel through initially. It was filled with potential dangers, terrifying demons, lakes of fire, imposing gates guarded by fearsome supernatural beings, and confusing, winding paths. Getting lost, taking a wrong turn, failing to know and recite the correct magical spell at the right moment could mean disaster, entrapment, or even destruction before ever reaching the final judgment or the safety of Aru. The texts, we call the Book of the Dead, functioned essentially as a map and guidebook needed precisely because of this fear of the perilous journey. These fears, the fear of robbery and violation, the fear of erasure and being forgotten, the fear of the Ka starving, the fear of failing judgment, the terror of annihilation and the second death, and the fear of getting lost in the dangerous underworld, they paint a picture of deep insecurity underlying the grand monuments and elaborate preparations. It helps us understand the desperate need for protection, for magical defenses, for the very curses that were sometimes etched onto tomb walls, which we'll explore next. They weren't just passively hoping for the best, they were actively trying to anticipate and ward off the many potential disasters that haunted their vision of eternity. It was all profoundly human. All right, let's gently focus now on what was arguably the most pivotal, most anxiety-inducing moment in the entire envisioned afterlife journey for an ancient Egyptian. The Judgment. Chapter: The Ultimate Stress Test, Heart Weighing. Having navigated potential dangers, perhaps aided by spells from their Book of the Dead, the deceased Egyptian soul arrives at the most critical point, the imposing Hall of Two Truths. Here, within this solemn chamber, the ultimate test awaits, the solemn weighing of the heart. This single, pivotal moment, depicted countless times in funerary art, determines their entire eternal fate, blissful eternity or complete non-existence. Imagine the individual soul perhaps appearing just as they did in their former life, standing quietly, likely feeling apprehensive, before a great and formidable assembly of divine beings. It's not just the chief judge, Osiris, but often 42 imposing assessor gods are shown looking on, listening intently, observing closely, each representing a standard of cosmic law. A profound sense of being carefully evaluated, utterly exposed, must fill the silent hall. Central to this austere divine scene stand the magnificent scales of judgment. These are not the common scales of a marketplace, but depicted as grand, ornate instruments, likely imagined as being crafted from pure gleaming gold. They are a powerful symbol, representing not just weight, but cosmic balance, the very principles of Ma'at, truth, divine order, and unwavering justice, the absolute standard against which a human life is about to be measured. Presiding directly over the operation of these sacred scales is the familiar figure of the god Anubis, instantly known by his calm, watchful jackal head, the traditional guardian of cemeteries and the expert guide of souls on their journey. It is often Anubis who is shown gently leading the deceased soul forward towards the apparatus, his steady, divine hand carefully placing the fragile, vital heart onto the waiting scale pan, a reassuring yet solemn guide in this moment of ultimate consequence. The heart itself, the IB, as the Egyptians called it, rests on one side of the scale. To the ancient Egyptians, the heart was the absolute core of a person's being. It was considered the center of intelligence, the source of all emotion, the repository of memory, the foundation of intention and will. and, crucially, the seat of their conscience. It was believed to hold the complete, indelible record, the very essence of the person's entire life, containing every deed, every word, every hidden thought. On the other scale pan sits the counterweight, something that seems almost impossibly light, delicate, almost ethereal, yet holds infinite significance. It is the single, pure white ostrich feather symbolizing the goddess Ma'at herself. Ma'at embodies the fundamental concepts of truth, justice, cosmic order, universal harmony, representing the perfect, divinely ordained standard of how things should be according to divine law and the structure of the cosmos. The weighing itself begins. Anubis, with solemn focus, carefully balances the heart, the complex sum of a lifetime's choices, actions, secrets, and motivations, directly against the simple, pure feather of truth. Imagine a moment of intense, almost unbearable, silent tension filling the air, as all eyes, both divine and the deceased's own, watch the delicate balance beam. Will it remain perfectly level? Will the heart prove itself light enough, pure enough? During this intensely stressful process, the deceased soul is expected to recite the declarations of innocence, sometimes referred to more dramatically as the negative confession. Addressing the 42 divine judges, they firmly state a long list of specific wrongdoings they claim not to have committed. I have not committed sin against people. I have not stolen. I have not spoken falsehood. This recitation served as a crucial affirmation of their adherence in life to the fundamental principles of Ma'at. Nearby stands the respected figure of Thoth, the god of wisdom, knowledge, and sacred writing, typically recognized by his elegant ibis head, a bird associated with the moon and careful measure. He holds his scribe's palette and reed brush, poised and ready to meticulously, impartially record the official, final result of the weighing. Whatever outcome the scales ultimately decree, he is the incorruptible record-keeper of the gods. Overseeing the entire solemn proceeding, often depicted seated majestically on a grand throne, is the revered god Osiris, the undisputed lord of the underworld, himself a potent symbol of death, judgment, and enduring resurrection. He is the ultimate judge in this divine court, lending immense gravity to the occasion, and it is he who confirms the final verdict delivered by the scales. And lurking close by the base of the scales, an unavoidable, truly ominous presence waits the monstrous figure of Amit, known chillingly as the devourer of the dead or the eater of hearts. She is depicted as a terrifying composite beast, possessing the fearsome head of a crocodile, the powerful forequarters of a lion, and the heavy hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She embodies utter destruction for the unworthy soul, waiting patiently, hungrily for her meal. Pause now and reflect on the profound psychological weight of this single defining moment. How can one truly, fairly measure the entirety of a complex human lifetime in one objective test? Every complex thought, every small, forgotten action, every secret intention, supposedly contained within that single organ. What truly makes a heart heavy in the precise eyes of the gods? Is it great evil, or merely an accumulation of small imbalances? The anxiety must have been truly immense for the soul awaiting judgment. Slowly, deliberately, the great scales finally settle. The delicate balance beam ceases its subtle movements and finds its final, unwavering position, or it tips decisively to one side. All attention in the vast hall of two truths is fixed entirely upon that crucial indicator. Does the heart perfectly balance the feather? Is it, miraculously, even lighter? Or does its accumulated burden pull its side of the scale inexorably down? If the heart balances, or is even found to be lighter than Ma'at's feather, imagine the overwhelming wave of cosmic relief washing over the waiting soul. It is declared Mayakeru, meaning true of voice, essentially vindicated or justified. Thoth carefully inscribes the favorable verdict onto his eternal records. Osiris, the great judge, nods his divine approval. The perilous part of the journey is finally over. The path to the serene, peaceful field of reeds, Ayaru, is now open. But if the heart proves heavy, demonstrably weighed down by sin, by injustice, by a fundamental imbalance with Ma'at, it sinks its scale pan. The verdict is instantaneous, harsh, and terrifyingly final, guilty. There is no appeal, no mitigating circumstance considered now. Amit, the ever-watchful devourer, lunges forward without delay. She swiftly consumes the condemned heart, and in that horrifying instant, the soul, the consciousness, the individual's very existence is extinguished forever. Utter oblivion. This is the dread second death. This singular, highly dramatic ceremony, the weighing of the heart, vividly captures the absolute core of ancient Egyptian afterlife anxiety. Everything they hoped for, survival beyond physical death, achieving a blessed eternity, finding lasting peace, hinges entirely and precariously on the outcome of this one ultimate pass/fail test. All the painstaking preparation, the complex mummification, the treasures, the spells, all of it leads inexorably to this defining moment, standing vulnerable before the divine scales, hoping, perhaps praying desperately, that one's heart would somehow prove to be as light, as pure, as Ma'at's delicate feather. All right, let's delve into the remarkable tool the ancient Egyptians developed to cope with the profound anxieties surrounding death and the afterlife journey. Chapter: Navigating the Darkness, the Guidebook. We've explored the many anxieties plaguing the ancient Egyptian mind regarding the afterlife, the fear of getting lost within the dark and confusing underworld, the terror of failing the critical final judgment, the dread of encountering hostile demons, or suffering the horror of having one's name forgotten or erased. Faced with such profound uncertainties and manifold dangers, it's only natural they sought some form of tangible assistance, some reliable guide to help them navigate the perilous journey they believed lay ahead. This assistance came primarily in the form of a fascinating collection of texts that we, today, commonly call the Book of the Dead. This is a modern, somewhat misleading name, however, coined by early Egyptologists who often found these scrolls buried with the deceased. The ancient Egyptians themselves knew these collections of spells by more evocative titles like the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or, perhaps more accurately, Spells for Going Forth by Day. This original name beautifully reflects the ultimate goal: successfully emerging from the darkness and dangers of the Duat, the underworld, into the eternal light of the Field of Reeds, effectively being reborn into blissful eternity, like the sun god Ra emerged each morning. It's very important to understand that the Book of the Dead wasn't a single, standardized book with a fixed table of contents and chapters, like we might imagine today based on the name. Instead, it was really a compilation, a corpus, a collection drawn from nearly 200 distinct magic spells, hymns, prayers, and ritual texts developed over centuries. Individuals, or more often their families, preparing for their burial, could commission a scribe to create a papyrus scroll containing a specific selection of these spells, chosen based on personal perceived need, local tradition, religious fashion, and, quite frankly, what the person or family could afford to pay for. So, what was the primary purpose of this highly personalized guidebook to eternity? Firstly, and perhaps most crucially for the anxious traveler, it served as an indispensable navigational aid. The Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was imagined as a complex, confusing, and decidedly dangerous landscape, filled with hazards and hostile entities. The spells within the Book of the Dead provided essential knowledge, detailed maps of certain treacherous regions, specific instructions for bypassing hazardous obstacles like lakes of fire or boiling water, and powerful magical formulae for pacifying or actively repelling hostile supernatural beings they might encounter. Beyond simple geographical navigation, the afterlife journey was believed to involve passing through numerous imposing gates or pylons, each often guarded by fearsome, knife-wielding deities or demons, whose job was to prevent the unworthy from proceeding. These intimidating guardians wouldn't grant passage unless the deceased soul could demonstrate specific, secret knowledge. Often, this meant correctly reciting the hidden names of the gate itself, its various bolts and posts, and sometimes even the name of the guardian creature. The Book of the Dead conveniently provided these necessary, esoteric passwords and powerful utterances, aiming to ensure the soul wouldn't be eternally trapped or destroyed. The Book of the Dead also included a fascinating category of spells aimed at empowering the deceased soul directly, granting them specific magical abilities needed to overcome particular challenges or simply to enhance their status and mobility in the afterlife. Some spells, for instance, allowed the soul to transform its shape at will, perhaps taking the form of a swift falcon to fly past danger, a sinuous serpent to navigate narrow underground passages, a powerful crocodile to swim safely through underworld waterways, or even a beautiful symbolic lotus flower, signifying rebirth and purity. These transformations provided a sense of agency and magical protection within the strange and mutable landscape of the afterlife. Perhaps most revealing of the underlying anxiety surrounding the entire process, however, were the spells specifically designed to help the deceased successfully pass the critical weighing of the heart ceremony that we discussed earlier. Even if one had lived a relatively good and pious life, The fear of that final judgment, the terrifying possibility that some forgotten transgression or unconscious impurity might tip the scales unfavorably, was clearly immense. The Book of the Dead offered direct magical assistance even for this central trial, most notably through the famous and widely included spell 30B. Spell 30B is often referred to simply as the heart spell, and its intended purpose was profound, speaking volumes about the Egyptians' deepest fears regarding judgment. It was conceived as a powerful enchantment intended to prevent the deceased's own heart, remembered as the seat of their conscience, intellect, and memory, from speaking out or bearing witness against them during the delicate weighing process before Osiris and the 42 divine judges. It's a spell born directly from the relatable human fear that one's own inner self, one's own conscience, might inadvertently betray them at the single most critical moment of their existence. This crucial spell was very frequently inscribed under protective heart-shaped amulets, typically carved from green stone like jasper or serpentine, amulets which we now call heart scarabs, due to often being shaped like the sacred beetle on the reverse side. These powerful amulets were then placed directly upon the mummy's chest during the wrapping process, positioning the potent magic precisely where it was most needed, right over the physical heart, or where it had been. The words of the spell themselves, delivered here with calm emphasis to convey their intent, capture the desperate plea, "O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart which I had upon earth, do not stand up against me as a witness, do not create opposition against me before the judges, do not weigh heavy against me before the Lord of the balance." A profound plea for silence from within. Another vital function for existing successfully in the afterlife, supported by magical text often included within Book of the Dead scrolls, or certainly associated with the wider funerary process, concerned the magical restoration of the deceased's physical senses. This was primarily achieved through the important rituals known collectively as the opening of the mouth ceremony. This complex rite was typically performed by priests on the mummy itself, or sometimes on statues of the deceased placed within the tomb chapel, just before the tomb was finally sealed forever. Specific spells, like Spell 23 from the Book of the Dead corpus, which carries the title Spell for Opening the Mouth of Nen, the deceased's name, magically facilitated this ritual opening of the mouth. The ultimate goal was to ritually and magically reanimate the deceased's senses, allowing their ka and ba, residing within the preserved body or statue, to once again speak, absolutely crucial for reciting needed spells and justifying oneself before the gods, to eat and drink the perpetual offerings provided, to see the path ahead through the Duat, and to hear the pronouncements of the gods and other spirits. It essentially enabled full sensory interaction with the afterlife environment. How was all this powerful magic believed to actually work? For the ancient Egyptians, written words, especially the sacred hieroglyphs and the accompanying images, held inherent potent power. The very act of writing down a spell correctly, particularly when performed by a knowledgeable and ritually pure scribe, and then placing that text with the deceased, was thought to imbue the scroll with tangible magical potential. It was believed that the deceased soul could then actively recite the spells as needed in the afterlife, or perhaps even that the mere presence of the inscribed text was enough to activate its protective or transformative effects automatically when a specific danger arose. Complementing the columns of hieroglyphic texts on most Book of the Dead scrolls were intricate illustrations, known today as vignettes. These small, often colorful pictures depicted the spell's content visually, showing the deceased standing confidently before Osiris, successfully navigating specific underworld obstacles, transforming into various powerful animals, or being declared true of voice after the judgment. These weren't just decorative elements. They were believed to possess magical efficacy themselves, reinforcing the power of the written spells and perhaps aiding the deceased soul in understanding and correctly activating the magic when required. It's crucial to remember that the specific compilation of spells included in any given Book of the Dead scroll, the overall quality of the papyrus used, the skill and neatness of the scribe's handwriting, and the detail, artistry, and color employed in the vignettes varied enormously across time and individual. A wealthy noble or high official might commission a magnificent, lengthy, beautifully illustrated scroll containing scores upon scores of different spells, representing a significant investment. Conversely, a person of more modest means might have only been able to afford a small, simple strip of papyrus, inscribed with just a few essential utterances deemed most critical for survival. Access to this vital guidebook was very much tiered by wealth and social status. Ultimately, the collection of texts we call the Book of the Dead can be seen as perhaps the most comprehensive, detailed, and tangible manifestation of the deep-seated anxieties the ancient Egyptians held about the nature of death and the perilous journey beyond. It represents a monumental, multi-generational effort to impose order, knowledge, and predictability onto the terrifying unknown. It was an attempt to anticipate every potential danger, every obstacle, every frightening uncertainty, and to provide a customized, magical toolkit designed specifically to counter the many fears and potential failures that haunted their perception of eternity. In its essence, the Book of the Dead was their indispensable, personalized survival guide for the afterlife. It functioned as a collection of crucial maps, essential passwords, powerful cheat codes, protective charms, and divine reassurances, all meticulously assembled and often customized for the individual owner. Born directly from profound human fear and deep anxiety about navigating the darkness of death, the Book of the Dead offered not just practical instructions for the soul, but also a vital measure of hope, a comforting sense of agency, and the cherished possibility of successfully coming forth by day into the eternal blissful light. All right, let's turn our attention now from the spiritual preparations and guidebooks to the more tangible aspects of ensuring a successful afterlife. The items placed within the tomb itself. Chapter: My Eternal Stuff. We've journeyed through the intricate Egyptian concepts of the soul, the Ka, the Ba, the Yak, the terrifying ordeal of judgment before Osiris, and the essential guidebook, the Book of the Dead, designed meticulously to help navigate the afterlife's many perils. Now, let's focus our attention back onto the physical tomb, the House of Eternity, and the absolutely crucial importance the ancient Egyptians placed on equipping it properly for its deceased inhabitants. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture of remembrance. It was considered essential packing for a journey lasting forever. Why were ancient Egyptian tombs so often filled with a vast array of objects, ranging from simple pottery vessels to elaborate gilded furniture? This practice stemmed directly and logically from their deeply held beliefs about the different components of the soul and their needs after death, the concepts we discussed earlier. The Ka, remembered as the vital life force, required ongoing physical or symbolic sustenance to survive, much like a living person needs daily food and drink. The Ba, representing the individual personality, needed a familiar, comfortable environment to return to each night, and potentially tools and status symbols for its continued existence in the idyllic field of reeds. For the Egyptians, these weren't mere grave goods in our sense. They were considered practical, functional necessities for eternity. Perhaps most fundamental among these provisions were items intended for the direct sustenance of the Ka. Tombs routinely contained actual preserved food items, carefully prepared for longevity. Common examples include dried meats, preserved fowl, various grains, dried fruits, and specially baked loaves of bread. Perhaps even more importantly for the very long term, vast quantities of beer and wine, staples of the Egyptian diet, were stored in sealed pottery jars. Alongside these real consumables were detailed miniature models of food items, models of granaries, bakeries, and breweries, as well as extensive, colorful paintings and reliefs on the tomb walls, depicting grand banquets, fertile fields, and abundant agricultural harvests. All of this aimed at magically and perpetually ensuring the Ka would never suffer hunger or thirst throughout eternity. Beyond basic sustenance for the Ka, the Egyptians equipped their tombs to provide recognizable comfort and help maintain the deceased's earthly status in the afterlife, essentially creating a familiar and welcoming home for the mobile Ba personality when it returned to the preserved body or statue each night. This meant including actual items of furniture used in daily life, sturdy beds for rest, comfortable chairs and stools for sitting, wooden chests for storing afterlife possessions, and intricately carved headrests for sleeping, believed to protect the sleeper. Fine clothing, bolts of fresh linen, valuable jewelry, cosmetic palettes for makeup, polished bronze, mirrors, and perfumed oils were also common inclusions, allowing the deceased to maintain their earthly appearance, hygiene, and comforts indefinitely. Life in the field of reeds, the paradise called Eru, while depicted as blissful and free from earthly sorrows, was also imagined by the Egyptians as involving some familiar work, specifically agricultural labor, necessary to cultivate one's allotted plot in this idealized, eternally fertile landscape mirroring the Nile Valley. Therefore, tombs often contain tools considered necessary for this afterlife work. These could be miniature symbolic models, or sometimes even full-sized, functional farming implements like hoes, simple wooden plows, sharp sickles for harvesting grain, and reed baskets for carrying produce. For nobles or royal officials, items related specifically to their earthly roles and status, such as weapons and chariots for a soldier, or scribal palettes, and writing equipment for an official, were included to help maintain their function and identity in the next world. But the envisioned eternity wasn't solely about work and basic sustenance. Leisure and enjoyment were also clearly anticipated and planned for. Reflecting this hope for continued recreation, many tombs from various periods included popular board games, particularly the game of Senet. This game, often called the Game of Passing, itself held deep symbolic connections to the soul's perilous journey through the afterlife towards eventual success. Other items for enjoyment, like musical instruments such as lutes or ritual rattles called sisterums, cherished pets carefully mummified to accompany their owners, and other treasured personal items, were lovingly packed for the long stay, catering to the presumed needs of the Ba, or the transformed Ak, for familiar recreation and pleasure. Among the most distinctive, numerous, and fascinating items found in many Egyptian tombs, especially from the Middle Kingdom period onwards right through to Roman times, are the small figurines known commonly today as Shabtis, or sometimes Ushabtis. These figures, typically depicted in mummy form and often shown holding tiny agricultural tools like picks and hoes, weren't merely decorative items or symbolic representations of servants in a general sense. They possessed a very specific, crucial, and magically activated purpose, cleverly designed by the Egyptians to alleviate a major potential afterlife burden. The explicit function of the Shabti figure was entirely magical. These figurines were intended to act as willing substitutes, as dutiful deputies for the deceased individual. It was a common belief that all inhabitants of the blessed field of reeds, regardless of their former earthly status, from pharaoh down to farmer, could potentially be called upon by the gods, particularly Osiris, to perform various forms of manual labor needed to maintain the paradise. These tasks might include cultivating fields, digging essential irrigation canals, or transporting sand from east to west. The Shabti figure, when magically activated by the potent words of spell 6 from the Book of the Dead, a spell frequently inscribed directly onto the figurine itself, was expected to answer the call in the deceased's place, dutifully proclaiming, "Here I am," and performing the required task. Ideally, a well-equipped individual hoping for a comfortable afterlife aimed to possess a large contingent of these tireless magical workers. The theoretical perfect set, described in some texts, included 365 Shabtis, one worker figure for each day of the Egyptian year, plus an additional 36 figures designated as overseer Shabtis, equipped with whips, presumably to manage the daily workers efficiently. This made a grand total of 401 figures for complete coverage. However, the actual number found in tombs, along with their material ranging from simple, rough clay or wood to exquisite, brightly colored faience or carved stone, and the quality of their craftsmanship varied hugely depending entirely on the wealth and status of the deceased owner. Some royal tombs contained hundreds of high-quality examples. Many others contained just a few, or perhaps none at all. Now, let's carefully reconnect this deliberate abundance of essential afterlife goods, the food and drink, the tools and furniture, the comforts, the crucial magical helpers like Shabtis, with the pervasive and unfortunate reality of tomb robbery that we mentioned earlier as a major source of anxiety. This threat wasn't just theoretical or occasional. Archaeological evidence shows it was a constant, widespread problem throughout almost all periods of Egyptian history. Tombs, even relatively modest ones belonging to non-royals, were frequent targets for thieves seeking valuables, and, crucially, these thieves weren't always just seeking easily portable gold, silver, or precious jewelry. Sometimes even basic provisions, essential tools, everyday pottery, or statues vital for the BA's return were stolen, broken, or carelessly damaged during the intrusion. Consider for a moment the potentially devastating impact of such a violation. From the devout, ancient Egyptian perspective, if the carefully prepared food and drink offerings, whether they were real preserved items or symbolic models and wall depictions meant to magically provide sustenance, were stolen or destroyed by robbers, the deceased's Ka faced the terrifying prospect of potential starvation and consequent weakening in the afterlife. Its very eternal existence was thereby jeopardized. The entire carefully planned system for ensuring perpetual sustenance would collapse, likely leading, in their view, to a miserable, diminished, and perhaps ultimately finite afterlife for that essential aspect of the soul. Similarly, imagine the Ba personality returning to the tomb after its daytime travels, expecting to find its familiar comforts, the tools needed for its anticipated work in Aaru, or its diligently provided contingent of Shabti workers ready to answer the call for labor, only to find them missing, smashed, or stolen. its envisioned afterlife existence would be severely compromised. It might lack the means to cultivate its allotted plot in the field of reeds, potentially be forced by the gods to perform the dreaded manual labor itself, lose its expected status among the other blessed dead, or simply exist in a barren, uncomfortable, and violated tomb home for eternity. The entire meticulously constructed plan for a successful and pleasant eternal life could be tragically and irrecoverably disrupted by tomb robbers. This perspective highlights a crucial point that is often overlooked when discussing ancient Egyptian tomb robbery solely in terms of glamorous treasure hunting for gold masks and jewels. For the ancient Egyptians who lovingly and carefully prepared these burials over years, the overwhelming fear triggered by the thought of tomb robbery wasn't primarily about the loss of mere monetary value or earthly wealth, which was useless to the dead anyway. Instead, it was about the catastrophic loss of the essential supplies, the functional afterlife equipment, and the vital magical support systems like Shabtis, all of which were deemed absolutely necessary for the soul's basic survival, its ongoing comfort, and its ability to function properly and maintain its status throughout the whole of eternity. It was fundamentally about existential survival and well-being. This deep, pervasive, visceral fear, the fear of the K potentially starving for eternity, the fear of the Ba being destitute, uncomfortable, and forced into hard labor forever, the fear of the entire carefully arranged afterlife plan catastrophically failing due to selfish theft, created a powerful, urgent motivation within Egyptian society. It led directly to the desperate need felt by tomb owners and their families to find effective deterrence, any possible ways to actively discourage and perhaps supernaturally punish potential tomb violators who threaten not just mere possessions, but the very eternal well-being and future existence of the beloved deceased, and so consequently enter the infamous tomb curses. While archaeological evidence suggests they were perhaps not quite as common or as universally applied as popular culture sometimes suggests, the deliberate use of explicitly written threats and magically potent curses, often inscribed prominently near tomb entrances or within accessible offering chapels, was undeniably one such deterrent strategy employed by the ancient Egyptians. These curses, which we will examine more closely, were born directly from this profound anxiety, from the desperate and very understandable need to protect the tomb's absolutely vital contents, the eternal provisions for the Ka, the essential tools for the Ba, the magical Shabtis for labor from desecration and theft, thereby attempting to safeguard the deceased's chances for a complete and successful afterlife. In conclusion, the ancient Egyptian tomb, whether a grand pyramid or a modest rock-cut chamber, was conceived by its builders as far more than a mere burial place or memorial. It was envisioned quite literally as an eternal life support system, a fully equipped and magically activated home and resource base, intended to sustain the soul's complex journey and its ongoing existence for millions of years. Protecting the physical integrity of the tomb and its carefully chosen, essential contents was therefore considered absolutely paramount. This overwhelming need for guaranteed protection, driven by profound and pervasive anxieties about ensuring afterlife survival and function, helps us to understand why they might eventually resort to employing extreme measures like invoking the dreadful wrath of the gods and attempting to unleash magically potent curses upon anyone who dared to disturb their vital eternal stuff. Alright, having established the deep anxieties surrounding the afterlife and the vital importance of protecting the tomb and its contents, let's examine one of the most direct responses to these fears, the tomb curse. Chapter: The Magic Fence. Anatomy of a Curse. Given the profound fear surrounding tomb robbery and the potential devastation it could wreak upon the deceased's carefully planned afterlife, it's entirely understandable that the ancient Egyptians sought ways to actively protect these sacred spaces. Beyond physical barriers like hidden entrances, sliding stone portcullises, or heavy granite sarcophagi, they sometimes employed another, potent layer of defense, the specific, magically charged deterrent that we commonly, and perhaps rather dramatically, call the tomb curse. You might think of it as an invisible, magically potent fence erected around their eternal home and its vital provisions. It's worth noting right away, however, that these explicit written curses, despite their fame in popular culture, weren't necessarily placed in every single ancient Egyptian tomb. While compelling and sometimes quite chilling examples certainly exist, particularly from certain historical periods like the Old Kingdom and often found associated with the private, non-royal tombs of officials whose owners perhaps felt more personally vulnerable or inclined toward such measures, Many tombs seemingly relied primarily on their physical security measures, their intended secrecy, or simply upon the general religious piety and societal taboo against desecrating the dead. Explicit curses appear to have been an additional potent measure used when felt necessary rather than a universal feature of every burial. So, where were these magical warning signs typically erected within the tomb complex? Logically, curse inscriptions are most often found in locations where a potential intruder, or even an unauthorized or ritually impure visitor, would be highly likely to see them upon approaching or attempting to enter the restricted, sacred areas of the tomb structure. Common spots for these inscriptions include the main entrance doorways, carefully carved onto the heavy stone lintels spanning the top of the doorway, or inscribed down the vertical door jambs on either side. They also appear within the more public offering chapel areas, perhaps on commemorative stone slabs known as stelae bearing longer texts about the deceased, or sometimes prominently displayed on the false door, the symbolic portal intended for the Ka's passage. Occasionally, protective texts are even found inscribed on statues guarding the tomb entrance. Visually, how did these curses appear? They were typically rendered in the same manner as other formal high-setter inscriptions found within the tomb, usually as carefully carved hieroglyphs cut into the stone walls, lintels, or stelae, sometimes further enhanced with paint. They were often integrated quite seamlessly into the tomb's overall decorative and textural scheme, presented as a legitimate part of the formal inscriptions commissioned by the owner. The clear intention was that these explicit warnings were meant to be seen, to be read, at least by the literate minority within society, which might include rival officials, priests, or educated individuals who could potentially pose a threat, and above all, to be taken seriously and respected. The language employed for these inscriptions was almost invariably the formal, sacred hieroglyphic script, using the complex and beautiful hieroglyphics believed by the Egyptians to be the Meduneter, or words of the gods themselves, inherently lent the curse text a powerful sense of divine authority, inherent magical potency, and official, undeniable gravity. It immediately signaled that this inscription was not mere graffiti, nor a casual warning from the owner, but a serious, ritually empowered declaration with potentially dire supernatural consequences for anyone foolish enough to ignore its stated prohibitions. The typical tone and style observed in these curse texts often feel quite formal, sometimes strikingly legalistic, resembling the language used in official decrees, contracts, or court judgments from the period. They frequently followed a specific, almost formulaic structure, commonly employing introductory phrases that translate roughly along the lines of, "As for any person who shall," or "regarding anyone who may." This opening statement would then be followed by a clear description of the prohibited action or actions, and subsequently by a detailed outlining of the specific, often unpleasant punishment or punishments that the text declared would inevitably befall the transgressor as a direct consequence of their violation. While often formal, the tone could sometimes become more direct and starkly threatening towards the end. These protective texts were often quite specific in identifying who exactly they were targeting with their threats, attempting to encompass various potential categories of violators. They might explicitly name any man, any noble, any scribe, any official, any priest, or more broadly just any person or anyone who might dare to commit the forbidden act against the tomb or its owner. So this comprehensive approach aimed to leave no potential intruder, regardless of their social standing or role, feeling somehow exempt from the inscribed warning and its associated supernatural menace. Equally specific were the descriptions of the actual transgressions that would trigger the curse's activation. The lists of condemned actions varied, but common examples included entering the tomb precinct in a state of ritual impurity, perhaps having recently eaten pork or fish, which were taboo in some sacred contexts, causing any physical damage whatsoever to the tomb structure, its reliefs, paintings, or statues, stealing the vital food and drink offerings left for the sustenance of the Ka, removing, damaging, or otherwise disturbing the mummy itself, interfering with the proper performance of the funerary rituals or the ongoing offering cult, or even speaking evil, falsehoods, or insults against the name and reputation of the deceased tomb owner. The crime was clearly defined. A key element observed in the structure and mechanism of most surviving Egyptian tomb curses is that they rarely, if ever, claimed that the deceased tomb owner themselves would personally rise up from the dead in mummy form to physically exact vengeance upon the violator, despite what later horror movies might suggest. Instead, these curses typically functioned by invoking powerful external forces, primarily specific gods, to act as agents of punishment on the deceased's behalf. The curse text would formally call upon certain, often fearsome deities, such as Thoth, the divine reckoner of sins, Osiris, the ultimate judge of the dead, the lioness-headed Sekhmet, goddess of plague, destruction, and vengeance, or sometimes powerful local city or gnome deities, asking them to witness the transgression and then personally inflict the promised punishment upon the hapless offender. The nature of the threatened punishments themselves varied considerably, but often cleverly targeted the violator's well-being and prosperity in this current life, aiming for immediate, understandable, and relatable negative consequences. Curses might threaten, for instance, that the offender would swiftly lose all their earthly property and possessions, be humiliatingly stripped of their official position or social standing, suffer a painfully shortened lifespan filled with misery, be afflicted with terrible and incurable diseases sent by Sekhmet, fail to produce children, especially a crucial male heir needed to continue their own family line and funerary cult, or face public disgrace, social ruin, and complete isolation from their community. Perhaps even more chillingly, from the ancient Egyptian perspective, many curses explicitly targeted the transgressor's own afterlife prospects, ingeniously using their shared religious beliefs and afterlife anxieties against them. Threats in this category might include dire promises that the offender would undoubtedly face a harsh and unfavorable judgment themselves when they eventually died and stood before Osiris, that they would be definitively and permanently excluded from the blessed paradise of the Field of Reeds, that their own Ka would consequently starve for lack of offerings in eternity, that their Ba would find no rest or peace, or that their own precious name, so vital for eternal existence, would be utterly blotted out from memory and forgotten forever by both gods and humans. Without needing to dwell on excessive drama, some common specific phrases found in these texts include rather visceral promises, such as stating plainly that the offender's neck shall be wrung like a bird's, or invoking divine opposition by declaring that various powerful gods shall oppose him and shall destroy him. Other threats were simpler but no less potent within their belief system, such as, he shall be judged for it in the divine court of Osiris, implying a guaranteed negative outcome. Other common formulae directly threatened the continuity of the offender's entire family line, stating starkly and devastatingly, his heir shall not inherit. A truly terrifying prospect in a society so focused on lineage and family continuity. It's absolutely essential when considering these texts to remember the profound ancient Egyptian belief in the inherent, almost tangible power of the written word, especially when inscribed using the sacred hieroglyphic system. The curse text itself, once it was correctly composed according to magical principles and formally inscribed within the tomb by authorized personnel, was believed by many Egyptians to possess its own active, latent magical force. It didn't necessarily require constant divine attention or intervention to function. The magic inherent in the words was thought by some to activate almost automatically, triggered by the very act of transgression itself, thereby unleashing the specified negative consequences directly upon the unfortunate violator. Therefore, these ancient Egyptian tomb curses should certainly not be misinterpreted as merely simple expressions of random anger by the deceased, nor as spiteful or hateful graffiti, nor even as just examples of primitive superstition. They were, in fact, carefully composed magical texts, often following established legalistic or potent liturgical formulae, likely created by literate scribes and priests familiar with religious and magical practices. They were intended as a serious, specific, and magically potent form of active deterrent, designed quite deliberately to protect a sacred space and its absolutely essential contents from any form of violation. While the ancient Egyptians certainly seem to have believed in the potential magical efficacy of these inscribed curses to directly harm violators, arguably their primary intended function might well have been psychological. These inscriptions served as stark public warnings, playing directly upon the deeply ingrained fears, the shared religious beliefs, and the significant social anxieties concerning divine justice and afterlife prospects that were held by almost everyone in ancient Egyptian society, including presumably potential tomb robbers themselves. The hope, quite possibly, was simply that the palpable fear of divine retribution or horrific personal consequences, both in this life and potentially in the next, would be sufficiently potent to make potential violators think twice, hesitate, and ultimately decide to leave the tomb and its occupant undisturbed. In summary, then, the ancient Egyptian tomb curse functioned essentially as a deliberately crafted, highly specific and magically potent keep out sign. It stands as a clear manifestation of the tomb owner's profound, pervasive anxiety about the security of their eternal home, and the critical protection of the provisions deemed absolutely necessary for their successful afterlife survival and comfort. It powerfully reflected their deep cultural faith in the inherent power of the written word and the certainty of divine justice to act as an effective protective barrier, a potent magic fence, safeguarding their meticulously planned and provisioned journey into the vast expanse of eternity. All right, let's refine our understanding of these ancient Egyptian tomb curses by looking more closely at exactly who they were intended to ward off. It reveals a lot about the breadth of their anxieties. Chapter: Who are we cursing? It's not just thieves. We've established that ancient Egyptians sometimes used carefully written curses as a form of potent magical protection for their tombs, functioning like a magic fence against potential harm or disturbance. But who exactly were these powerful warnings aimed at? When we carefully read the surviving texts of these curse inscriptions found on tomb walls, stelae, or statues, we discover that the intended targets and the specific actions being prohibited were surprisingly varied and numerous. The protective net was cast remarkably wide, revealing a truly comprehensive spectrum of underlying fears that extended far beyond the simple, immediate fear of thieves stealing gold or other treasures. Naturally, the most obvious target, the one that immediately springs to mind and is most often associated with tomb curses in our popular imagination, was indeed the malicious tomb robber. This term refers specifically to the individual who would commit the heinous act of violently breaking into the sealed tomb, often under cover of darkness, with the clear intention of plundering its valuable contents. Items like intricate jewelry buried with the mummy, precious metals inlaid in furniture, or finely crafted symbolic objects placed within the burial chamber. Curse texts frequently and explicitly condemn anyone who would enter this tomb wrongfully, steal anything from it, or lay destructive hands on the property therein, promising swift and terrible divine retribution for such blatant desecration and theft against the sacred peace of the blessed dead. However, the expressed concerns articulated in these protective texts often extended well beyond just the theft of valuable portable goods. Many curse inscriptions also specifically threatened divine punishment upon anyone who would cause any form of physical damage to the tomb structure itself, regardless of whether or not theft actually occurred during the intrusion. This could include harming the beautifully carved reliefs or the fragile painted scenes adorning the walls, deliberately damaging the statues representing the deceased owner or the protective deities placed within the tomb, intentionally defacing the vital inscriptions, especially those containing the owner's name, their essential N, or even just carelessly moving foundation stones or otherwise interfering with the tomb's carefully constructed architectural integrity. Profound respect for the physical house of eternity was clearly demanded of all. Another clearly defined category of unwelcome visitor frequently targeted by these protective curse texts was anyone who dared to enter the sacred space of the tomb proper, or even just its associated outer offering chapel, while they were considered to be in a state of ritual impurity. Ancient Egyptian religion placed enormous emphasis on complex purity laws and specific taboos, and certain actions or conditions, such perhaps as eating forbidden foods like pork or certain types of fish shortly before entering or failing to perform required cleansing ablutions, rendered a person ritually unfit or unclean to approach the divine sphere or the hallowed resting place of the blessed dead. Explicit curses often warned such impure individuals to stay far away, lest they spiritually contaminate the sacred precinct and automatically incur severe divine wrath simply for their disrespectful presence. Intriguingly, and perhaps revealingly about the anxieties surrounding long-term care, the inscribed threats weren't solely directed at hostile outsiders or the ritually careless visitor. Some curse formulae seem implicitly, or sometimes even quite explicitly, aimed at those individuals who should have been actively supporting the deceased's afterlife needs. This particularly included those family members or formally appointed mortuary priests who held the responsibility for maintaining the essential, ongoing offering cult at the tomb. Individuals who neglected these sacred duties, perhaps by failing to bring the contractually required regular food and drink offerings, forgetting to recite the proper beneficial formulae for the deceased, or simply allowing the tomb structure itself to fall into disrepair through prolonged indifference, might find themselves subtly, or sometimes quite directly, warned against such potentially devastating negligence. This clearly reflects the deep cultural fear of being forgotten by the living and the consequent starvation of the essential Ka spirit. Closely related to this pervasive fear of simple neglect by otherwise responsible parties was the equally serious concern expressed in some texts about any deliberate interference with the proper performance of essential religious rituals associated with the tomb. Curse texts might threaten anyone who disrupts the complex funerary rites conducted at the time of burial itself, or, perhaps more commonly, anyone who interferes with the ongoing, necessary offering cult activities carried out regularly in the tomb chapel across subsequent generations. Ensuring these rituals continue correctly and perpetually, often funded by specific agricultural land endowments left by the deceased for this purpose, was seen as absolutely vital for the deceased's continued well-being and effective status in the afterlife. Any malicious disruption was therefore viewed as a serious offense against the deceased, their surviving family, and the gods overseeing the cult. Protecting the legal ownership and, crucially, the exclusive use of the expensive, carefully prepared tomb was also clearly a major concern, expressed in some of these protective curse texts. Certain inscriptions specifically target anyone who might attempt to nefariously usurp the tomb for their own burial, or perhaps clear it out disrespectfully for the secondary burials of their own family members, effectively and disgracefully kicking the rightful owner out of their designated and consecrated eternal home. We find phrases in some inscriptions like, "As for any man who shall take possession of this tomb as his own property, or who shall cast out the rightful owner," promising dire consequences directly from the gods for such a blatant appropriation of another person's carefully secured and highly personalized afterlife arrangements. Beyond the serious issue of unauthorized secondary burials by opportunistic successors, curses also sometimes address the more mundane problem of the tomb or its accessible outer areas being used improperly for other non-funerary purposes that violated its inherent sacred character and dedicated function. Political threats could be leveled against anyone caught using the tomb chambers merely as temporary shelter for themselves or perhaps their flocks of animals, a known issue in some areas, or employing the protected space illicitly as a workshop, a convenient storage area for goods, or even worse, as a readily available quarry for obtaining dressed stone blocks for other unrelated building projects. The tomb was sacred ground, consecrated and dedicated solely to the deceased owner. Any such profane use was strictly forbidden and deemed inherently worthy of supernatural punishment. The deceased's personal reputation and enduring memory among the living were also considered vital assets requiring fierce protection, potentially even long after their physical death. Consequently, tomb curses frequently included specific clauses threatening anyone who would dare to speak ill of the entombed individual after they were gone, tell malicious lies about their character or actions during life, intentionally damage their good name, their precious ren, considered essential for ongoing identity, or actively try to erase their memory from the minds of the living community. Maintaining a positive reputation among the living and ensuring the name endured through offerings and respectful remembrance were seen as crucial factors for achieving and maintaining a successful and respected afterlife status. This made malicious slander or destructive gossip a potentially supernaturally punishable offense within this comprehensive protective framework. Just occasionally, the remarkable scope of these protective curses seems to extend even further, sometimes appearing to target those very individuals involved in creating, or perhaps later maintaining, the tomb's vital inscriptions, the scribes themselves. There are rare but intriguing examples that seem to warn scribes against improperly copying, deliberately altering, carelessly omitting parts of, or otherwise damaging the sacred texts inscribed within the tomb, which could potentially include the protective curse inscription itself, thus rendering it magically ineffective. This perhaps reflects the profound cultural belief in the precise, inherent power of the correctly written hieroglyphic word, and the critical need felt by the owner to preserve the magical integrity and absolute accuracy of all inscriptions exactly as they were originally intended. Considering this remarkably wide array of specified potential transgressions that these curses sought to prevent, ranging from violent robbery and deliberate physical destruction to ritual impurity and careless neglect of required duties, through unauthorized reuse of the space for burial or mundane activities, right up to verbal slander against the deceased's good name and even potential scribal error in the texts, it truly reveals the deeply comprehensive, almost anxious nature of ancient Egyptian concerns about their afterlife. The worries articulated in these protective texts clearly weren't just about safeguarding valuable material possessions from thieves. They encompass safeguarding every conceivable aspect of the deceased's physical tomb environment, their ongoing ritual sustenance needs, their personal reputation among the living, and ultimately, their overall fragile chance for achieving a peaceful, well-provisioned, high-sank, and eternally undisturbed existence. Therefore, the magic fence metaphor for the ancient Egyptian tomb curse seems particularly apt, as it was clearly designed, conceptually at least, with a very broad protective perimeter indeed. It aimed to keep out not just the obvious opportunistic burglar seeking easily portable treasure, but also the ritually careless visitor bringing impurity, the potentially neglectful relative or priest failing in their duties, the disrespectful squatter seeking mere shelter, the ambitious rival seeking to usurp the expensive burial space, and even the malicious gossipmonger trying to damage the tomb owner's good name long after their physical death. It functioned, in intent at least, as a truly comprehensive blanket protection against a perceived multitude of potential threats, both physical and metaphysical, that could compromise the tomb owner's meticulously constructed and dearly hoped-for eternal peace, prosperity, and enduring reputation among gods and mortals alike. Okay, we understand who might be targeted by these ancient Egyptian tomb curses, a wide range of people who could potentially harm the tomb or the deceased's afterlife prospects. But what exactly did these curses threaten to do to those transgressors? Let's explore the specific punishments invoked. Chapter: The Dire Threats, What Curses Promised. Having established who the ancient Egyptian tomb curses were aimed at, encompassing not just thieves but also vandals, neglectful priests, disrespectful visitors, and even slanderers, let's now examine more closely the specific punishments these magical texts threatened to unleash upon them. What dire consequences precisely did these solemn inscriptions promise for those unfortunate or foolhardy enough to ignore the warnings and transgress against the sacred space of the tomb or its rightful owner? The answers found in these texts reveal a grim catalog drawing directly upon core Egyptian beliefs about divine justice, cosmic order, and the prerequisites for a successful afterlife. Perhaps the most fundamental and frequently invoked category of threat involved calling down divine wrath upon the offender. The curses didn't typically just vaguely mention godly displeasure, they often specified active hostile opposition and direct retribution from members of the powerful Egyptian pantheon. Common phrases found translate along the lines of, "The gods shall oppose him," "He shall be hateful to the gods," or "That specific deities named in the text shall reckon with him for it." This painted a terrifying picture for the believer, the transgressor facing the focused, active hostility of the very forces governing the cosmos, this world, and especially the next. Often, specific deities known for particular forms of judgment or retribution were named in the curse texts, adding significant weight and specificity to the threat. The fearsome lioness goddess Sekhmet, known for her destructive power and association with plague, might be called upon to unleash fiery destruction or pestilence upon the offender. Thoth, the wise god of writing, measure, and divine judgment, might be invoked to ensure the transgressor's sins were meticulously recorded and brought forth for punishment. Osiris himself, the revered lord and ultimate judge of the underworld, could be asked specifically to judge the offender harshly upon their arrival in his realm. Even powerful local city or regional patron gods might be named, ensuring divine justice would find the culprit wherever they might reside or travel. Beyond purely supernatural threats taking effect after death, many curses cleverly promised unpleasant punishments that would strike the violator during their remaining time on earthly life, targeting their social standing, material success, and general well-being. Common threats found in these inscriptions included the prediction of losing one's official position, rank, or respected titles within society. They might threaten the confiscation of the offender's lands, house, and property, leading to sudden poverty. The complete loss of social honor and respect within their community, being shunned and disgraced, was another potent threat, aimed at undermining the transgressor's current prosperity and status, making any potential reward gained from tomb robbery seem far less appealing in comparison. Direct physical harm inflicted during this life was also a common theme within the curse repertoire. Protective inscriptions might threaten the offender with a severely shortened lifespan, perhaps promising starkly that they would not complete their years on Earth, or die prematurely and violently. They might invoke painful, lingering, and incurable diseases, often explicitly attributed to the vengeful wrath of specific deities, like the aforementioned Sekhmet, the bringer of plagues. Vague threats of general suffering, unending misery, and a life filled only with misfortune were also common components of the promised earthly punishments, designed to instill fear of immediate consequences. The specific manner of death itself could be described in particularly terrifying ways within some cursed texts, often seeming to deliberately echo the punishments reserved for the enemies of cosmic order within Egyptian mythology itself. Some inscriptions threatened death by drowning, a fate mirroring that of the mythological enemies of the sun god Ra, who were ritually overthrown in the primordial waters of Nun. Others invoked death by burning, a method strongly associated in the Egyptian mind with complete annihilation and the prevention of any afterlife. Being devoured by fierce predatory animals like crocodiles or hippopotami, creatures often associated with the forces of chaos and danger lurking in the Nile, represented another horrific and symbolically charged end promised to those who dared violate a sacred tomb. Perhaps one of the most chilling threats of all, from an ancient Egyptian perspective, focused intently on afterlife preparation, was the specific promise that the transgressor would be utterly denied a proper burial themselves when their time came. This was a truly devastating prospect, playing directly upon the culture's deepest anxieties about achieving a successful and perpetual afterlife. To be denied the essential rites of mummification, to lack a secure and properly equipped tomb, to miss out on the necessary accompanying rituals, and crucially, to have no ongoing offerings provided after death, this complex of failures meant one's Ka spirit would inevitably starve, one's Ba personality would become lost and unable to reunite with the body, and one could consequently never hope to transform into a blessed Akh spirit among the gods. It essentially doomed the violator to eternal unrest, misery, or perhaps even complete oblivion, the very fate they were potentially inflicting upon the tomb owner they disturbed. Cleverly, the curses also sometimes specifically targeted the violator's own spiritual components, directly weaponizing the complex Egyptian concepts of the soul against them. Threats might promise, for example, that the offender's own Ka would suffer perpetual agonizing hunger and thirst in the afterlife, finding no sustenance or relief, or they might decree that the violator's own Ba personality would become eternally restless and tormented, unable to find its way back to its body, perhaps unburied or decayed, unable to achieve transformation, forever lost and wandering aimlessly in the terrifying darkness and dangers of the Duat. Damage to the transgressor's family line and legacy was another potent and frequently employed category of threat. Curse texts often stated starkly and unequivocally that the offender shall have no heir, or sometimes specified even more pointedly, no son, who could inherit their property, carry on their family name into the next generation, and, most crucially, from an afterlife perspective, perform the necessary funerary rites and establish the ongoing offering cult required for their own successful afterlife. In a society so deeply focused on lineage, ancestry, and family continuity, this threatened not just personal oblivion after death, but the complete eradication of the entire family line and memory from the earth, a truly catastrophic and terrifying outcome. Finally, reaching the absolute pinnacle of afterlife anxiety, many tomb curses directly and explicitly threaten the violator's chances at succeeding in the final judgment before Osiris. They might promise grimly that the offender's heart shall not be justified when placed upon the scales in the critical weighing of the heart ceremony. Of texts explicitly stated that when the guilty party inevitably stands before Osiris, their many sins, perhaps including the tomb violation itself, will be loudly proclaimed. Their heart will undoubtedly be found heavy with wrongdoing, and they will consequently be handed over immediately to the waiting jaws of Ammit the Devourer. This invoked the ultimate Egyptian horror, the second death, complete annihilation of consciousness, and the absolute irreversible end of individual existence forever. It's crucial for us to understand these detailed and varied threats not as merely primitive superstition or simple angry outbursts by the tomb owner, but as reflections of a deeply held cultural belief in cosmic justice, the power of magic, and the interconnectedness of actions and consequences. The Egyptians largely believed in a form of inevitable cause and effect, where negative actions, particularly the desecration of sacred spaces like tombs, would naturally attract severe negative consequences, often delivered through direct divine intervention or targeted magical means. The cursed texts simply articulated these expected consequences in the starkest possible terms, intending them as serious, binding, magically potent pronouncements upon any future violator. In conclusion, the arsenal of punishments detailed within ancient Egyptian tomb curses was remarkably comprehensive and seemed strategically designed to inspire the maximum possible fear and deterrence in any potential wrongdoer. These threats deliberately targeted nearly every aspect of a person's existence and core beliefs within that culture: their worldly success, social standing, and reputation, their physical health and the manner of their death, the fate of their physical body after death, burial, the eternal survival and well-being of their essential soul components, Ka and Ba, the continuation and prosperity of their family line, and ultimately, their very chance at achieving a successful, blessed eternal afterlife versus suffering complete and final annihilation. By methodically hitting virtually every known anxiety point in the complex Egyptian worldview, these dire threats aimed to make the perceived risk of violating a protected tomb utterly, terrifyingly unthinkable. Okay, let's broaden our focus slightly. We've spent considerable time exploring the very specific anxieties surrounding death and the afterlife in ancient Egypt, and how these deep fears directly led to the creation of sometimes elaborate tomb curses as a form of potent magical defense. However, it's important for us to realize that this cultural reliance on curses and magically charged threats wasn't solely confined to the darkness and silence of the tomb or anxieties about eternity. Similar practices and the underlying mindset that produced them were also present and seemingly quite active in the daylight world of everyday ancient Egyptian life. To fully appreciate this, we need to briefly recall the fundamental ancient Egyptian worldview, a perspective where magic, known to them as Heka, was considered a primal, legitimate, and powerful force inherent in the very fabric of creation itself. Heka wasn't seen as inherently good or evil, like some later concepts of magic might suggest. Rather, it was a neutral power, a divine energy that could potentially be wielded by the gods, by the state acting on their behalf, by knowledgeable priests and ritual specialists, and perhaps even by determined individuals for a wide variety of purposes. These could range from healing the sick, ensuring fertility, providing protection, facilitating transformations, but also, significantly, for causing harm, compelling others, or enforcing agreements through supernatural coercion. Curses, therefore, were simply one particular application of this widely accepted and understood magical force operating within their world. One prominent and well-documented example of curses being used entirely outside a funerary context comes from the sphere of high-level state ideology and national political protection, the fascinating practice known today as execration rituals. The word execration itself simply means to denounce or curse something or someone vehemently. In ancient Egypt, these were formal, often elaborate, state-sponsored magical rituals, performed periodically, particularly during times of perceived threat or instability. Their aim was squarely and aggressively focused on neutralizing Egypt's perceived enemies, whether they were threatening foreign powers or troublesome domestic rebels. Execration rituals typically involved the symbolic identification and targeting of specific enemies by writing their names and sometimes associated curses onto particular types of specially prepared objects. Common choices for these objects were inexpensive, easily breakable red pottery bowls, or crude, quickly made clay or wooden figurines depicting bound captives. These figurines sometimes represented specific ethnic groups considered hostile, like Nubians, Libyans, or Asiatics, or might be more generic representations of bound foreign foes. The lists of names inscribed could include currently hostile foreign rulers, entire tribes or cities considered potential threats to Egypt's borders or interests, as well as specific named Egyptian individuals who were accused of rebellion, treason, or plotting against the divine authority of the pharaoh. The absolute core of the execration ritual involved the deliberate, symbolic, and often violent destruction of these inscribed objects bearing the enemy's names. The inscribed pottery bowls might be formally cursed and then deliberately smashed into pieces. The figurines representing captives might be bound tightly with cords, spat upon, symbolically pierced with bronze nails or knives, partially burned in a ritual fire, or sometimes buried upside down in ritually significant locations, such as near border fortresses, royal palaces, or major temples. And through the widely understood principles of sympathetic magic, the ancient belief that actions performed on an image, name, or effigy directly affect the real person or entity represented, this ritualized violence was confidently believed to magically weaken, incapacitate, confuse, or even destroy the actual enemies named upon the objects. The overarching purpose of these elaborate, state-level execration rituals was therefore quite clear: to magically protect the land of Egypt and the person of its divine king from all perceived external threats and any dangerous internal dissent. It functioned as a form of supernatural warfare, a magical dimension of foreign policy and internal security intended to supplement, or perhaps even sometimes replace, conventional military campaigns, complex diplomatic maneuvering, or straightforward internal policing. These rituals vividly reflect a deep-seated state anxiety about maintaining cosmic order, personified as Ma'at, against the ever-present forces of chaos, Isfet, that were believed to constantly press upon Egypt's borders and sometimes arise threateningly from within. Magic, in the form of these powerful curses, was seen as a vital and legitimate tool in this ongoing cosmic defense. Beyond these dramatic, high-level state rituals designed to protect the entire kingdom, compelling evidence also suggests that curses and magically potent threats found their way into more mundane, everyday civic, and perhaps even personal contexts within Egyptian society. This was particularly notable in situations related to legal matters, property rights, and contractual agreements. It seems the perceived power of a magically potent oath or a divinely backed warning could be deliberately harnessed by individuals or authorities to try and ensure compliance with rules, encourage honesty in testimony, and command respect for established boundaries and property rights in daily life. For instance, solemn oaths sworn during legal proceedings before judges or officials sometimes appear to have included self-cursing formulae as a way to guarantee truthfulness. An individual giving testimony might declare their statement as true, sometimes adding a potent self-curse like, "If I lie, may a donkey copulate with me," or more seriously invoking specific divine punishment upon themselves should their sworn statement later prove to be false. Similarly, boundary stones, known as stelae, which were set up to clearly demarcate the edges of fields, estates, or temple lands, occasionally bore protective inscriptions explicitly cursing anyone who dared to illegally move the marker, tamper with it, or otherwise encroach upon the rightful owner's precious agricultural land, often invoking local gods to punish such transgressions severely. While direct inscriptional evidence might be less commonly preserved than for the high-status tomb curse, which were intended to last eternally, it seems highly probable that similar types of magically potent threats were sometimes employed in the context of everyday business dealings and property matters among the general populace. Written land leases, loan agreements recorded on papyrus, or perhaps even oral contracts for goods and services might have sometimes included clauses invoking divine punishment upon any party who willfully defaulted on the agreed terms, attempted to cheat their business partner, or stole property entrusted to them. In a society with perhaps less formalized daily policing than our own, curses could potentially function as a form of readily available supernatural security deposit, or an inexpensive magical enforcement mechanism intended to encourage fair dealing. Furthermore, although often less formally documented in official inscriptions intended for public view or eternal preservation, numerous magical papyri survive from ancient Egypt, containing collections of spells clearly intended for use by individuals in managing personal disputes and conflicts. These fascinating texts include spells designed to magically bind enemies and restrict their actions, formula intended to silence rivals or accusers, perhaps in court or in social settings, spells aimed at winning court cases through supernatural influence rather than just legal argument, or even aggressive spells intended to inflict direct harm, illness, or misfortune upon someone perceived to have seriously wronged the practitioner. While perhaps blurring the definitional line between a formal curse and simply harmful magic, the existence of these texts strongly indicates that individuals likely employed magically potent threats and coercive actions against personal adversaries encountered in common conflicts over status, resources, romantic entanglements, or perceived insults within their communities. The crucial underlying point to grasp here is that the fundamental mentality driving the deliberate use of curses in these very daylight contexts, encompassing state protection, legal enforcement, property security, and personal conflict resolution, appears remarkably similar to the mindset that led to the creation and deployment of the tomb curses we examined earlier. It seems to stem from the same foundational elements of the ancient Egyptian worldview: a pervasive and unquestioning belief in the tangible efficacy of magic as a real force in the world, a corresponding, often palpable anxiety about potential threats arising from multiple sources, whether those are political enemies, untrustworthy contract breakers, encroaching neighbors, land thieves, personal rivals, or the dangers awaiting the soul in the afterlife. And consequently, a strong cultural desire to assert control over outcomes and ensure personal or collective security through the proactive application of supernatural power, often manifested as divine threats, that is, curses. In conclusion, therefore, while the curses inscribed within tombs are perhaps the most famous and enduring manifestation of this practice in ancient Egypt, it's clear that the use of magically potent threats was actually a surprisingly pervasive feature across many levels of their society, operating far beyond the confines of the tomb and concerns about death. Employed strategically by the state against its enemies, seemingly integrated into legal oaths and property demarcation practices, and very likely utilized by individuals in the context of personal disputes and anxieties, curses served as a versatile, culturally accepted tool for attempting to manage fears, enforce agreements, resolve conflicts, and generally assert control in a world that they perceived to be deeply permeated and constantly influenced by powerful, unseen magical forces. The particular mindset that produced the tomb curses was, it seems, deeply embedded in their everyday understanding and navigation of the world. All right, let's now turn to some actual examples of tomb curses from ancient Egypt. Examining these texts directly can give us a much clearer picture of their specific wording, the fears they invoked, and the seriousness with which they were intended. Chapter Tales of Terror, Famous Curses. We've now established the contexts and motivations behind ancient Egyptian curses, looking at how they functioned as magical defenses stemming from deep anxieties about the afterlife, It's one thing to speak of these protective inscriptions generally, but it's perhaps more illuminating and, in its own quiet way, more engaging to look at some specific examples of actual tomb curses that have survived through the millennia. These texts, carved into stone or written on papyrus, give us a direct, if sometimes unsettling, window into the anxieties and protective strategies of individuals from a world long past. It's interesting to note, before we delve into specifics, that many of the most explicit and fearsome-sounding curses that have been recorded by archaeologists tend to come from the tombs of private individuals, prominent nobles, powerful officials, regional governors, rather than from the tombs of the pharaohs themselves, especially in the later periods of Egyptian history like the New Kingdom. Pharaohs, by virtue of their divine status and immense resources, often relied more on the sheer physical scale and labyrinthine complexity of their tombs, like those in the Valley of the Kings. Their inherent divinity, the power of sacred funerary spells like the pyramid texts or the Book of the Dead for their own protection, and the overarching authority of the state to safeguard their royal burials. Private tomb owners, perhaps feeling more vulnerable to disturbance or neglect, sometimes seem to have resorted to more direct, explicit written threats to deter potential violators. A well-known and often cited example of a tomb curse from the Old Kingdom, dating back to around 2340 BCE, comes from the mastaba tomb of a high-ranking official named Ankh-Mahor, who also held the name Sesi at the necropolis of Saqqara. His curse clearly targets anyone who would dare to enter his tomb with evil intent or attempt to do any harm to its structure or contents. The inscription solemnly warns that such a person will face judgment by the great god, and then vividly threatens a series of terrifying supernatural retributions involving some of Egypt's most fearsome creatures. Specifically, Ankh-Mahor's curse, carved for eternity, declares, "As for any man who shall enter into this tomb in his impurity, I shall seize his neck like that of a bird. As for him who shall do anything evil against this my tomb, the crocodile shall be against him in the water, the snake shall be against him on land, the hippopotamus shall be against him in the water, the scorpion shall be against him on land." This powerful imagery paints a terrifying picture of inescapable danger from powerful aggressive animals, ensuring the transgressor would find no safety in any environment, a comprehensive and chilling threat. Another prominent Old Kingdom governor, a man named Harkhuf, who lived around the 23rd century BCE and was famed for leading important expeditions into Nubia from his base in Aswan, also included a stern warning within his tomb inscriptions. His curse focuses quite pointedly on protecting the physical integrity of his burial and all its contents from any form of molestation. It states, "As for any man who shall enter into this tomb, or who shall do evil to it, or who shall damage it, I shall be judged with him by the great God. I shall wring his neck like a bird." This particular phrase, "I shall wring his neck like a bird," or its common variant, "his neck shall be wrung like a bird's," is a potent and frequently encountered idiom found in several ancient Egyptian threat formulae, not just in funerary contexts. It implies a swift, decisive, and perhaps rather ignominious end for the unfortunate transgressor, much like how a small, defenseless bird might be quickly and easily dispatched. It powerfully conveys a sense of immediate and brutal efficiency in the promised punishment, leaving little doubt in the reader's mind about the seriousness of the tomb owner's intent to see divine justice enacted. Moving forward in time to the First Intermediate Period, a more turbulent era of political fragmentation in Egypt that occurred around the 22nd to 21st centuries BCE, we find a particularly vivid and remarkably detailed curse in the rock-cut tomb of Ankhtifi. Ankhtifi was a powerful and assertive nomarch, a provincial governor of Mo'ala in Upper Egypt, a significant figure during this unsettled time. His tomb inscriptions are notable for their extensive biographical detail, their boasts of his accomplishments, and also for their fierce and uncompromising protective language. His curses are very specific about the actions that will trigger divine retribution, especially focusing on any disruption of his essential offerings or damage to his lasting legacy. Ankhtifi's powerful curse proclaims, with stark authority, "As for any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to this coffin, may he not exist, may his son not sit upon his seat, may his house not exist, may his Kas not accept any of his offerings, and may his flesh not be interred. He shall be for the fire, and he shall be for the execration of the officials." He further adds that anyone who dares to damage his statues, his chapel, or any of its inscriptions will inevitably meet a similar dreadful fate. This curse specifically targets the violator's lineage, their ability to receive offerings themselves, and their very existence, all core components of achieving a successful and perpetual afterlife in the Egyptian belief system. Even as late as the New Kingdom, a period of great power and empire for Egypt, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, When explicit curses in royal tombs became less common, respected private individuals certainly continued to employ them to protect their own eternal resting places. A notable and often quoted example from this era is the protective decree associated with the funerary chapel of Amenhotep, son of Hapu. This man was a highly revered scribe, architect, and sage who served under Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BCE. He was granted the rare honor of a mortuary temple near the king's own magnificent temple on the West Bank at Thebes, and the decree protecting his foundation contained very strong warnings against any interference. The decree for Amenhotep, son of Hapu's funerary foundation explicitly stated that anyone who damaged his endowment, who meddled with his tomb or its offerings, or who interfered in any way with his established cult, would face the direct and terrible anger of the supreme state god, Amun-Ra. The text further promised that such a violator's body shall not receive rites in the necropolis, that he shall not receive funerary offerings himself, that he shall not bequeath his property to his children, and that his name would become abhorrent and be blotted out. This was a comprehensive threat aimed at ensuring the total social, religious, and afterlife destruction for anyone daring enough to harm his legacy. Now, no discussion of tomb curses, however brief, would truly be complete without addressing the most famous and enduring one of all, the so-called Curse of Tutankhamun, sometimes more broadly referred to as the Curse of the Pharaohs. This alleged curse gained sensational worldwide notoriety in the 1920s and beyond, following the groundbreaking discovery of Tutankhamun's largely intact royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings by the British archaeologist Howard Carter, and significantly the subsequent death a few months later of Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's wealthy financial backer, from an infected mosquito bite that led to blood poisoning. It's absolutely crucial to state clearly and unequivocally from the outset that the Curse of Tutankhamun, as popularly imagined, that is, a specific malevolent spell written prominently in his tomb explicitly promising swift death or misfortune to all who entered, is largely a modern media creation, a popular myth that took on a life of its own. There is no single overarching curse inscription found within Tutankhamun's actual tomb that matches these sensationalized newspaper accounts or later fictional portrayals. The deaths of several other individuals connected in some way with the excavation over the subsequent years were also attributed by the press to this supposed curse, but most of these deaths were readily explainable by natural causes given the individual's ages and health. And it's also important to remember that many others involved in the tomb's opening lived very long and healthy lives. However, this potent and enduring myth likely didn't arise from absolutely nowhere. It probably capitalized effectively on the general public's existing, albeit often vague, knowledge that ancient Egyptians did sometimes place protective texts or warnings in tombs. This was coupled with a natural human awe, and perhaps a slight trepidation, surrounding the disturbance of ancient royal burials, especially ones so rich and untouched. While no direct curse inscription of the commonly understood threatening type was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, there were, of course, numerous protective magical texts and sacred objects intended to safeguard the king. For example, an inscription on a magic brick found in one of the ceiling walls of the burial chamber invoked the god Osiris, and was designed to repel any enemies or negative forces that might threaten the deceased king. But this was a standard protective formula for the pharaoh's well-being in the afterlife, not a direct curse aimed at those entering the tomb. The idea of a vengeful pharaoh's curse also tapped into a deeper, more universal psychological resonance, a primal respect for the sanctity of the dead and their final resting places, and perhaps a romanticized, somewhat thrilling fear of ancient, mysterious, and potentially dangerous magical powers. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was an unprecedented global media sensation in the 1920s, a time of great interest in Egyptology. The narrative of powerful, vengeful spirit guarding its plundered treasures proved simply irresistible to newspapers eagerly looking for dramatic stories and higher circulation, regardless of a firm factual basis in specific inscriptions found within that particular burial. The genuine ancient Egyptian curses that we've examined in some detail, from officials like Ankh-Maor, Harkhuf, or Ankhtifi, and sages like Amenhotep, son of Hapu, were actually quite different in their nature and presentation. They were specific, often legalistic-sounding texts, clearly naming particular transgressions that were forbidden, and invoking defined, though often severe, punishments, usually to be enacted by specific named gods. They functioned as a deliberate, magically charged, and very direct form of keep out sign aimed at deterring specific unwanted actions. The popular Tutankhamun curse narrative, by contrast, was far more nebulous and all-encompassing, attributing almost any misfortune that befell anyone connected with the tomb, however tangentially, to its disturbance. This narrative was fueled much more by early 20th century sensationalism and speculation than by any actual ancient texts discovered within that specific royal burial. In conclusion, while the curse of Tutankhamun remains a powerful and captivating modern legend endlessly repeated in popular culture, the genuine examples of tomb curses from ancient Egypt provide us with a much more fascinating and authentic glimpse into their real anxieties and their profound faith in the protective power of the written magical word. From stark threats of divine judgment and terrifying animal attacks in the Old Kingdom to comprehensive promises of lineage destruction and denial of afterlife prospects in later periods, these ancient texts clearly show the seriousness with which Egyptians from various walks of life sought to protect their eternal peace and their provisions for the afterlife. They reveal a world where magic and religion were deeply and inextricably intertwined with the very practical human need for security, especially when facing the profound and enduring uncertainties of eternity. All right, let's now consider who was actually responsible for creating these potent magical texts we call tomb curses. Who were the individuals with the knowledge, the skill, and the authority to inscribe these warnings intended to last for eternity? Chapter: The Curse Writers, Who Cast the Spells. We have journeyed through the various anxieties that permeated ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, and we've seen how tomb curses were meticulously employed as one of the sophisticated tools to try and allay these deep-seated fears. They acted as magically charged guardians, silent sentinels intended to protect the deceased, their tomb, and their essential eternal provisions. But this naturally raises an intriguing and important question. Who exactly were the individuals responsible for conceiving, crafting, and inscribing these potent, often rather terrifying magical texts? Who, in essence, cast these spells, designed to maintain their power for millions of years, as the Egyptians hoped? The complex process of creating and implementing a formal tomb curse, particularly those found in well-attempted tombs, was generally not the act of a single shadowy sorcerer muttering incantations, as popular fiction might sometimes suggest. Rather, it was typically a more structured, collaborative effort, deeply rooted in the established societal structures, religious beliefs, and specialized skills available within ancient Egyptian civilization. The primary impetus, the very desire for such powerful magical protection, naturally and logically originated with the tomb owner themselves, or perhaps with their immediate family, acting diligently on their behalf to secure their afterlife. After all, it was their personal eternal well-being at stake, their specific fears needing to be addressed, their carefully planned eternal peace and provision needing to be robustly secured against any potential threat. Commissioning the construction and decoration of a tomb, especially one of any significant size or featuring elaborate painted or carved reliefs, was a major undertaking in ancient Egypt. It represented a very significant investment of material resources, considerable time, sometimes years, and the coordinated efforts of numerous skilled laborers and artisans. The inclusion of detailed inscriptions within the tomb, whether these were biographical texts recounting the owner's achievements, essential offering formulas, hymns to the gods, selections from religious texts like the Book of the Dead, or indeed specific protective curses, was an absolutely integral and highly valued part of this overall funerary project. The tomb owner therefore functioned as the patron, the discerning client who initiated, financed, and oversaw the entire endeavor, including any particular curse text they or their advisors deemed necessary or desirable for their ultimate protection. Once the important decision to include a protective curse within the tomb's inscriptions was made, the crucial and highly specialized task of drafting the actual textual content would then fall to literate professionals, the scribes. In a society where true literacy, the ability to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script, was a relatively rare and specialized skill, possessed by only a small percentage of the total population, scribes were absolutely indispensable figures. They were the recognized masters of the intricate hieroglyphic and the more cursive hieratic scripts, the official keepers of literary traditions and textual formulae, and the skilled composers of all manner of formal written documents, ranging from mundane administrative records and detailed legal contracts to sublime religious hymns, historical accounts, and, indeed, potent protective curse formulae for tombs. Ancient Egyptian scribes typically underwent rigorous and lengthy training, often commencing from a young age, during which they learned to meticulously read and write the hundreds of individual hieroglyphic signs, master the complex rules of grammar and syntax, and study the established literary forms and traditional textual compositions. Their hard-won expertise was highly valued and respected throughout Egyptian society. When it came to the specific task of composing a tomb curse, A well-trained scribe would draw upon their extensive knowledge of existing traditional formulae, as curses often shared common phrases and structures, the appropriate formal and often legalistic language required, the suitable divine invocations to ensure godly support, and the correct, magically powerful ways to phrase the threats to achieve maximum perceived magical efficacy and undeniable religious authority. It's highly likely that the detailed process of choosing the specific wording for an individual tomb curse sometimes involved a degree of close collaboration between the tomb owner or their representative and the scribe. The tomb owner might clearly express their particular anxieties and concerns, perhaps a specific fear of their carefully provided offerings being neglected by future generations, their important name being forgotten or deliberately erased, or their preserved mummy being desecrated by intruders. The skilled scribe would then take these general fears and translate them into the specific, conventional, and ritually potent language of a formal curse inscription, carefully selecting phrases, deities, and threatened punishments that were deemed most appropriate, traditional, and likely to be effective for that particular situation and social status of the owner. Beyond the scribe who meticulously drafted the words of the curse, another key figure in ensuring the perceived magical power and ritual effectiveness of the inscription was often the specialized religious functionary known as the lector priest, or kerheb in the ancient Egyptian language. The lector priest was a highly trained expert in sacred texts, religious doctrines, and ritual performance. Their primary and very visible role involved the precise recitation of religious spells, hymns, complex litanies, and ritual utterances during important temple services, major religious festivals, and, most crucially for our context, during funerary ceremonies, the mummification process, and the final consecration of tombs and their sacred contents. The lector priest possessed the indispensable specialized knowledge of how to correctly pronounce the sacred words, perform the associated symbolic gestures, and carry out all the necessary accompanying rituals in order to effectively activate or magically empower written texts, including any curse inscriptions within a tomb. It was a deeply ingrained belief in ancient Egypt that the spoken word, particularly when uttered by a trained, experienced, and ritually pure priest in the correct, traditional manner, brought the inherent magical power of the inscribed hieroglyphs fully to life. The lector priest's formal involvement, perhaps in reciting the curse during the tomb's dedication ceremony, would therefore lend the curse its full intended supernatural force, transforming it from mere written words on a wall into an active, enduring magical defense system. Once the curse text was carefully composed by the scribe and perhaps reviewed for accuracy and ritual appropriateness, or even formally consecrated by a lector priest, the vital physical task of actually inscribing the curse onto the tomb walls, stelae, statues, or other designated stone or wooden surfaces fell to yet another group of skilled professionals, the artisans. These included highly skilled draftsmen who would meticulously lay out the complex hieroglyphic signs on the prepared surface according to the scribe's copy, and then the stone carvers or painters, who would then carefully and permanently chisel or paint the intricate inscription, ensuring its lasting permanence and clear legibility for all of eternity, as was hoped. So we can see that the creation of a significant and formal ancient Egyptian tomb curse was often a rather complex multi-stage collaborative process. It typically began with the tomb owner's fundamental desire for protection and their formal commissioning of the funerary project as a whole. It then involved the essential literary and formalistic skill of the scribe in actually composing the curse text. It could also potentially involve the specialized ritual expertise of the lector priest in correctly empowering the sacred words through recitation and ritual action. And finally, it depended upon the fine craftsmanship of the artisans in giving the curse its lasting, visible, physical form within the sacred, protected space of the tomb. This entire elaborate process clearly underscores a fundamental aspect of ancient Egyptian society, the immense power, prestige, and practical importance that was associated with literacy. In a world where only a relatively small elite, primarily consisting of government officials, temple priests, and professional scribes themselves, possessed the ability to confidently read and write the complex scripts, the capacity to command the written word was a very significant source of both societal authority and personal influence. Consequently, access to the creation of formal, enduring texts, including magically potent ones like curses designed to last for millions of years, was largely confined to this literate upper stratum of society, or at least to those individuals who possessed the wealth and status to hire their specialized and costly services. As a direct consequence of this reality, the elaborate, formally inscribed tomb curses that we find and study today were predominantly a tool utilized by the wealthier and more powerful members of ancient Egyptian society. These were the individuals, the high officials, the provincial governors, the successful priests, the royal acquaintances who could afford to construct substantial and well-decorated tombs in the first place, and who could then further afford to employ the necessary teams of scribes, ritual specialists, and skilled artisans required to create, inscribe, and ritually consecrate these powerful and very specific magical inscriptions designed for their eternal protection. In this sense, the presence of a detailed curse could also serve as a subtle but clear marker of the tomb owner's high status, a silent declaration that the owner had both the means and the foresight to protect their extensive afterlife arrangements in the most potent and enduring ways that their culture made available. The curses, therefore, were not just about protecting easily portable physical goods like gold or jewelry from common thieves. They were, more fundamentally, about protecting the tomb owner's entire significant investment in their eternal life, their hard-won status in society, which they hoped to maintain in the afterlife, and their ongoing personal and family legacy. For the Egyptian elite, maintaining their name and good repute, ensuring the correct continuation of their mortuary cult by their descendants or appointed priests, and preserving their carefully constructed identity beyond the barrier of death were absolutely paramount concerns. The formally inscribed curse was a powerful statement intended to safeguard all of these crucial aspects against any form of future neglect, malicious interference, or desecration emanating from the unpredictable world of the living. This is not to say, of course, that ancient Egyptians of more modest means, who could not afford such elaborate tombs or inscriptions, had no recourse whatsoever to magical protection for their simpler burials. It is highly likely that more common folk employed simpler protective amulets buried with them, relied on potent spoken spells perhaps taught within families, or maybe even uttered less formal, unrecorded verbal warnings or pleas for respect at the time of burial. However, the elaborate, often beautifully carved and clearly magically charged curse inscriptions that have survived for us to study today primarily represent the sophisticated practices and deep-seated anxieties of those individuals who possess the necessary literacy or access to it, the significant material resources, and the unquestioned societal power to command such sophisticated and enduring forms of eternal guardianship. When we speak today of the ancient Egyptians casting these powerful spells or curses, it's important for us to move away from the somewhat anachronistic popular image of a single, robed wizard dramatically uttering incantations over a bubbling cauldron. In the specific context of these formal, ancient Egyptian tomb curses, the casting was more accurately a deliberate, often lengthy, and multi-layered process. It was deeply embedded in the careful, traditional composition of the sacred words by knowledgeable scribes. Their ritualized and permanent inscription within a consecrated and sacred space, the tomb, and the formal invocation of specific divine powers and cosmic justice through the precisely worded text itself. All of these elements combined were firmly believed to imbue the written words with a permanent, self-activating magical potency that would endure, protect, and, if necessary, punish for as long as the inscription itself remained intact. In summary then, the curse writers of ancient Egypt were not mysterious, isolated sorcerers operating outside society, but rather, more often, a dedicated team of skilled, respected specialists within that society. They included the tomb owners themselves, who provided the essential intent and the necessary material means for the curse's creation. They included the highly trained scribes who meticulously crafted the powerful and traditionally appropriate language. They potentially included the ritually knowledgeable priests who may have formally consecrated the words and the space. And finally, they included the skilled artisans who gave the curse its enduring physical form on stone or wood. Tomb curses, therefore, were a sophisticated product of a highly stratified and deeply religious society, one where sacred words, when correctly deployed, were believed to hold immense, tangible power, a power accessible primarily to those who possessed the means, the knowledge, and the authority to wield it in defense of their eternal future. All right, we've explored the types of curses, who they targeted, and what dire punishments they promised. This leads us to a very practical and perhaps modern question. Did these ancient Egyptian tomb curses actually work? Did crocodiles really appear on demand? Or did divine wrath truly strike down those who dared to violate a protected tomb? Healing in magic, belief in magic. We have journeyed through the many anxieties that shadowed the ancient Egyptian approach to death and the afterlife, and we've examined in some detail the nature of the tomb curses they sometimes inscribed, hoping to protect their eternal resting places and ensure their peace. This naturally leads us to a fundamental and perhaps somewhat skeptical modern question. Did these ancient curses, with all their fearsome threats, actually work? Did divine retribution, as promised in the inscriptions, truly and demonstrably fall upon those who dared to violate a protected tomb? Before we attempt to answer that question directly from our contemporary scientific perspective, it's absolutely crucial to carefully define what working might actually mean in this specific historical and cultural context. If by work we mean, did a particular curse literally cause a specific godlike Sekhmet to physically manifest and inflict a scientifically verifiable punishment upon a tomb robber, then our modern sensibilities and understanding of the world would likely lead us to say, no, probably not in that direct, observable sense. However, if we instead consider whether these curses functioned as effective deterrents within the ancient Egyptian belief system itself, and whether they provided a significant sense of security, agency, and control for those individuals who commissioned and relied upon them, then the answer becomes much more nuanced, complex, and indeed largely affirmative. The entire foundation for believing in the efficacy of curses, and indeed for most ancient Egyptian ritual practices, rests firmly upon their sophisticated and pervasive concept of Heka. Heka is often translated into English simply as magic, but this single word fails to capture its profound and integral nature within their worldview. For the Egyptians, Heka was not mere superstition or sleight of hand. It was seen as a fundamental primeval force, a divine energy that permeated the entire universe. It was an inherent power that the gods themselves used to create the cosmos, to maintain its order, ma'at, and to overcome the forces of chaos, isfit. Heka wasn't considered separate from religion or what they understood as natural law. Rather, it was inextricably intertwined with both, an essential part of how the world operated on all levels. Crucially, Heka was generally perceived by the Egyptians as being an essentially neutral force, not inherently positive or negative in itself. Like a powerful tool such as fire or electricity, it could be harnessed and skillfully directed for a vast array of purposes. The gods wielded Heka as part of their divine nature. The pharaoh, as the divine intermediary between the gods and humanity, was also expected to utilize Heka for the benefit of Egypt, and significantly, specially trained priests and ritual specialists, such as the lector priests Keriheb, whom we've mentioned previously, could learn to channel and direct Heka through the precise recitation of prescribed words and the performance of specific ritual actions. Therefore, a curse, in the ancient Egyptian understanding, was a deliberate, knowledgeable, and skilled application of Heka, carefully designed to create a specific, often harmful or powerfully protective effect through the use of potent utterances and the formal invocation of divine authority. Absolutely integral to the perceived operation of Heka, and thus to the power of curses, was the profound ancient Egyptian belief in the inherent, almost tangible power of words, particularly when those words were written down in the sacred hieroglyphic script or spoken correctly and with authority in a ritual context. Names, religious formulae, and specific potent utterances were not considered mere labels or empty sounds by the Egyptians. They were firmly believed to embody the very essence, the true nature of the thing being named or the action being described. To write something down with intent, especially a sacred text or a magically charged curse, or to speak it formally within a ritually charged context, was thought to give that statement an independent existence, a tangible reality, and an active, enduring agency in the world, capable of affecting reality. From this cultural perspective, a formally inscribed tomb curse was far more than just an angry warning or a hopeful deterrent. It was a meticulously constructed magical instrument, a specific and focused application of the divine power of Heka. The precise wording chosen by the scribe, the deliberate invocation of specific, powerful deities known for their retributive capabilities, and the formal, permanent inscription of the curse within the sacred, consecrated space of the tomb were all carefully designed to imbue the curse with lasting, self-activating magical potency. It was intended to be a permanent, magically charged protective field, an invisible but powerful guardian around the deceased, their possessions, and their hopes for eternity. So, returning to our question, did they work? One of the primary ways these curses undoubtedly functioned effectively was as a powerful psychological deterrent. Imagine an ancient Egyptian, perhaps a potential tomb worker, considering illicitly pocketing a small item, or a more determined individual contemplating the violation of a sealed tomb. If they encountered a clearly inscribed curse explicitly promising that, for example, the crocodile shall be against him in the water and the snake shall be against him on land, and if that individual fully shared the prevailing cultural belief in the power of Heka, the reality of the gods, and the potential for divine retribution, then the fear instilled by such a curse could be very real, very personal, and consequently very effective in preventing the transgression. It's absolutely essential for us to remember that potential tomb robbers in ancient Egypt were not, for the most part, modern-day skeptics operating with a purely scientific, secular worldview, dismissing such threats as mere words. They lived within the same complex, magical, religious, conceptual universe as the tomb owners themselves. They generally believed in the same gods, they understood the same deep-seated afterlife anxieties, and they acknowledged the potential power and danger of curses and divine anger. The threats inscribed on tomb walls were, in essence, speaking their own cultural language, directly addressing their own deepest fears about their personal safety in this life and their ultimate, eternal fate in the next. The curses, as we previously examined, often invoke specific well-known and often feared deities, such as Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess known as the bringer of plagues and destruction, Thoth, the wise god of writing, divine judgment, and the reckoning of sins, or Osiris himself, the revered lord of the underworld and ultimate judge of the dead. To an ancient Egyptian, these were not abstract theological concepts or distant mythological figures. They were perceived as very real, active, and immensely powerful beings who were believed to intervene directly and often decisively in human affairs, and who were certainly capable of dispensing justice and punishment as described in the curses. The threat of incurring their direct, personal, and unavoidable wrath was not something to be taken lightly or easily dismissed. It was a genuinely fearful prospect for any believer. Furthermore, the ancient Egyptians held a strong and enduring belief in the continuing power and influence of the blessed dead, the Aku. These were individuals who had successfully navigated the judgment of Osiris, whose hearts had been found true, and who had achieved a transfigured, effective spiritual state, residing among the gods. These powerful Aku spirits were thought to be capable of influencing the world of the living, both for good, bringing blessings to their descendants who maintained their cult, and potentially for ill, causing trouble for those who neglected or offended them. A formal curse inscription, therefore, might also have been perceived by some as magically empowering the deceased tomb owner themselves to act as a potent guardian of their own sacred space, or at least to effectively call upon divine or ancestral aid to protect their eternal rest and bring misfortune upon any transgressors. Beyond the level of individual psychological deterrence, tomb curses also likely functioned as a broader form of social and magical control within ancient Egyptian society. They publicly and permanently reinforced important societal norms, deeply held religious taboos, and widely accepted legal principles regarding profound respect for the dead, the absolute sanctity of burial places, and the inviolability of personal and funerary property, including the essential ongoing offerings. They served as a very public and enduring declaration that such transgressions against the dead would not go unpunished, whether by human law, if the culprit was caught, or perhaps more inevitably and certainly by powerful divine or inescapable magical means. In this way, they helped to maintain the perceived sacred order of the world. It's also quite plausible that any significant misfortune, unexplained illness, or untimely accidental death that befell someone in the community who was known or even merely suspected to have disturbed a tomb or stolen from the dead would likely have been widely attributed by others to the effects of that tomb's specific protective curse. Such occurrences, whether they were purely coincidental or not, would then serve as powerful, memorable, anecdotal evidence within the community, reinforcing the widespread belief in the genuine efficacy of these magical deterrents. This in turn would further strengthen their psychological impact on the general population through a kind of social confirmation bias. That being said, we must also honestly acknowledge the clear and abundant archaeological evidence. Tomb robbery was unfortunately rampant throughout much of ancient Egyptian history, from the earliest periods right through to Roman times. Clearly then, curses, however fearsome, did not deter all potential violators. Why was this the case? Perhaps some robbers were driven by extreme desperation, poverty, or overwhelming greed that simply outweighed their fear of supernatural consequences. Perhaps some individuals were indeed genuinely skeptical of such threats, even in that ancient era. Or, quite possibly, some professional or hereditary tomb robbers believed they possessed their own forms of counter-magic, powerful amulets or specific rituals that could protect them from the deceased's curse, or mollify the offended spirits. It's likely that a potential tomb robber, especially a more professional one, undertook a kind of informal, calculated risk assessment. They would weigh the perceived richness and potential rewards of a particular tomb against the perceived strength and complexity of its physical protections, hidden entrances, stone blockages, etc. and the perceived potency of any inscribed curses or magical guardians. Some robbers may even have specialized in ritually disarming tombs before entering, or believed that by leaving certain items behind or performing certain appeasement acts, they could somehow mollify the spirits of the dead or effectively negate the tomb's magical defenses. The struggle between the desire to protect the tomb and the desire to plunder it was an ongoing one, fought on both physical and perceived magical or ritual levels. From our predominantly modern, scientific, and materialist viewpoint, we would generally not expect the mere words of an ancient curse, however powerfully intended or divinely invoked, to magically and directly cause someone to fall physically ill, be attacked by a specific animal, or suffer a particular misfortune in a way that bypasses known physical laws. But for the ancient Egyptians, the belief in this potential was very real, culturally ingrained, and psychologically impactful. The reality of the curse's power was firmly rooted in a shared cultural understanding of how the cosmos functioned, an understanding where Heka, or magic, was an integral, active, and entirely legitimate component of that function, not separate from it. Therefore, the true effectiveness of ancient Egyptian tomb curses, when we ask did they work, likely lay not primarily in a direct, scientifically measurable form of supernatural causation that we could verify today. Instead, their profound power resided in their potent ability to tap into deep-seated psychological fears, widely held cultural beliefs about divine justice in the afterlife, and the pervasive understanding of magic as a real force in the world. They worked primarily because people believed they could work. This belief, in turn, undoubtedly shaped behavior, deterred at least some potential violators, provided a profound sense of security, agency, and comfort to those who commissioned them for their eternal protection, and powerfully reinforced the sacred order that the Egyptians constantly strove to maintain in the face of the great mysteries of death and eternity. Indeed, this enduring human belief in the potential power of ancient protective magic, even if not always fully understood or articulated, arguably contributed significantly to the readiness and enthusiasm with which the Curse of Tutankhamun myth was so widely accepted and sensationalized in the early 20th century. The very idea that these ancient, mysterious words associated with a long-dead pharaoh could still hold tangible power resonated deeply with a latent human fascination with the occult, and perhaps a residual, primal fear or respect for the dead. It demonstrates in a way that the anxieties and the belief in unseen forces surrounding the sanctity of the Egyptian tomb still held a powerful grip on the human imagination, even millennia later. As our sleepy exploration of ancient Egyptian afterlife anxieties and the world of tomb curses gently draws towards its close, let's take a few moments to reflect on the deeper meaning behind all these extraordinary efforts. What does this monumental investment in death truly tell us about the ancient Egyptian mindset? Chapter, Anxiety Underneath the Gold. Throughout our quiet journey into the fascinating and sometimes unsettling world of ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs, we've explored the remarkably complex understanding of the soul's different parts, the perceived perilous journey through the underworld known as the Duat, the crucial and daunting judgment before the great god Osiris, the incredibly elaborate preparations undertaken for burial, and the fascinating, often fearsome, tomb curses they sometimes employed as potent magical guardians for their eternal resting places. As we now begin to gather these threads towards the end of our sleepy exploration of this ancient civilization, it's perhaps a good time to circle back and reflect on a core, fundamental theme that seems to underpin so much of this intricate and enduring system: a profound, pervasive, and deeply human anxiety. Consider, just for a moment, the sheer, almost unimaginable scale of the collective effort and the vast material resources that the ancient Egyptians, as a society, poured into the concepts of death and burial over a period spanning not just centuries, but several millennia. The colossal pyramids that still pierce the desert skyline, inspiring awe and wonder, the vast and sprawling necropolises like Saqqara, Abydos, or Thebes, cities dedicated entirely to the dead, the incredibly intricate, time-consuming, and resource-intensive process of mummification, designed to preserve the human form indefinitely, the tombs filled often to overflowing with extensive provisions ranging from simple pottery vessels for food and drink to sumptuously gilded chariots and thrones, the meticulously inscribed and beautifully illustrated papyrus scrolls of the Books of the Dead. All of this taken together represents an unparalleled societal investment, a cultural preoccupation with preparing for what comes after this earthly life. A surface interpretation of this monumental dedication to funerary matters might initially lead one to conclude that the ancient Egyptians possessed an unwavering, almost supreme confidence in their detailed afterlife beliefs. One might easily assume that they were utterly certain of their individual path to a blessed and joyful eternity, and that these elaborate preparations were therefore merely the confident, almost celebratory provisioning for a guaranteed and thoroughly pleasant existence awaiting them beyond the grave. The glittering gold, the potent spells, the enduring stone monuments, all might seem like powerful affirmations of an unshakable and optimistic faith in their system. However, a deeper and perhaps more insightful interpretation, one that considers the full spectrum of their beliefs and practices, suggests a rather different underlying motivation for this extraordinary level of effort. It posits that this obsessive, almost compulsive level of detailed preparation might actually betray not supreme confidence at all, but rather a profound, deep-seated and enduring anxiety, a pervasive cultural fear that despite all their accumulated knowledge, all their meticulous rituals, and all their earnest efforts, things could still go terribly, catastrophically wrong. A fear that the path to paradise was fraught with peril and uncertainty, and that the alternative was not just disappointment, but something far, far worse. Think, for example, of the intense, almost desperate focus on preserving the physical human body through the complex art of mummification, and the equally vital importance placed on perpetuating the deceased's personal name, their Ren, through inscriptions and remembrance. While these practices certainly served the theological purpose of ensuring the Ka and Ba soul aspects had a physical anchor and a recognizable identity in the afterlife, the sheer effort and anxiety involved also speaks volumes about a fundamental fear of impermanence, a deep-seated terror of ultimate oblivion. If the physical body decayed beyond recognition, or if the name was entirely forgotten by the living, the individual, according to their beliefs, faced the dreadful prospect of ceasing to exist in any meaningful or effective way. This was a terrifying potential outcome that they sought to prevent at absolutely all costs. Consider also the constant pressing perceived need for offerings, food, drink, incense, clothing, to sustain the Ka, the life force, in the afterlife. The tombs were often filled with actual preserved food and drink items, with countless miniature models of provisions, bakeries, and breweries, and with endless vibrant depictions on the walls of lavish banquets and agricultural abundance. While this certainly demonstrates a clear hope for eternal sustenance and enjoyment, it equally reveals an acute underlying anxiety that these vital offerings might one day cease. There was a fear that descendants might forget their duties, that family lines might die out, or that formerly endowed mortuary cults might eventually fail due to changing circumstances over long periods. The myriad spells designed to magically ensure perpetual supply of offerings can be seen as a crucial magical safety net against the terrifying prospect of the Ka slowly starving in the lonely darkness and silence of the tomb. We've previously touched upon the inherently perilous nature of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, which was often envisioned as a dangerous, labyrinthine realm filled with terrifying demons, challenging supernatural gatekeepers, and confusing obscure pathways that could lead the unwary soul astray. The meticulously detailed religious compositions known collectively as the Book of the Dead, with their intricate maps of the underworld, their lists of essential passwords for gates, and their powerful spells of protection, transformation, and justification, can therefore be seen not just as a helpful, optimistic travel guide for the deceased. Instead, they can also be interpreted as a direct product of intense anxiety, a desperate, comprehensive attempt to equip the vulnerable soul with every possible tool against the very real fear of getting lost, being ensnared by hostile entities, or failing the many arduous tests set by the underworld's often malevolent inhabitants. And then, of course, looming over the entire afterlife journey, there was the ultimate hurdle, the final definitive reckoning, the weighing of the heart ceremony before the great god Osiris and the 42 divine judges in the Hall of Two Truths. The palpable anxiety surrounding this single critical moment of judgment is evident throughout Egyptian funerary literature, the lengthy negative confession, where the deceased had to deny a long list of specific sins, the powerful spells designed to prevent the heart itself from testifying against the deceased, such as the famous spell 30B inscribed on heart scarabs, the fervent pleas for justification before the divine tribunal. All of these represent concerted, almost desperate efforts to manage the overwhelming terror of failing this final, decisive test of one's moral worth and, as a consequence, being denied entry into the peaceful paradise of the field of reeds. The ultimate consequence of failing this divine judgment, as the ancient Egyptians profoundly believed, was not simply some form of temporary purgatory or consignment to a lesser, less pleasant region of the afterlife. It was the truly terrifying prospect of the second death, complete and utter annihilation, the extinction of consciousness, by the waiting jaws of the monstrous goddess Amit, the devourer of the unjustified. This ultimate horror, the prospect of absolute non-existence, of one's individual being extinguished forever from the cosmos, surely fueled much of the meticulous, almost obsessive preparation and the desperate desire for any available magical assistance. The entire elaborate system of spells, rituals, and provisions was, in large part, a multi-layered defense against this final, terrifying oblivion. Viewed through this particular lens of underlying anxiety, even the extensive array of grave goods carefully placed within the tombs can take on a slightly different, more urgent significance. They were perhaps not merely intended as comforting luxuries for a pleasant and leisurely eternal holiday in paradise, but rather as essential, almost desperate survival gear for what was perceived as a perilous and uncertain journey, followed by an existence that still required resources. The tools, the furniture, the clothing, the games, the weapons, all can be seen as attempts to equip the deceased for every conceivable eventuality, driven by a profound fear of lack, a fear of helplessness, and a fear of not being able to sustain oneself or maintain one's essential identity and status in the strange and challenging world beyond earthly life. The tomb curses themselves, which we have explored in some detail throughout our discussion, can also be interpreted as a direct and powerful symptom of this same pervasive underlying anxiety. If the ancient Egyptians had been truly and unshakably confident in the inherent safety of their tombs, and in the automatic success of their afterlife passage through divine grace or personal merit alone, would such aggressive, often terrifyingly specific magical defenses have been deemed so widely necessary? The very existence and prevalence of these curses strongly suggest a lingering fear that physical barriers, secrecy, and even divine favor might not, in the end, be enough to protect them from the actions of the living or the dangers of the afterlife. The truly comprehensive nature of what these curses aim to protect also speaks volumes about the breadth of their anxieties. They guarded against straightforward tomb robbery, yes, that is clear, but they also explicitly protected against any physical damage to the tomb structure itself, against ritual impurity brought into the sacred space, against the potential neglect of vital offerings by future generations, against the unauthorized reuse of the tomb by others, and even against verbal slander that might damage the deceased's name and reputation among the living. This remarkably wide net of magical protection was clearly woven because the fears themselves were equally comprehensive, touching upon every conceivable threat to a successful, peaceful, and well-provisioned eternal afterlife. Ultimately, the entire elaborate and enduring system of ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices, with all its complexities and seeming contradictions, can be understood as a profoundly human, albeit uniquely and magnificently expressed, response to the universal and timeless anxieties that surround our own mortality. It reflects our shared concerns about the unknown nature of death, and it embodies the innate, powerful human desire for continued existence, for meaning beyond the grave, and for lasting remembrance by those who follow. Their grand and costly preparations were in many ways a sustained and ingenious attempt to assert some measure of human control over the ultimately uncontrollable mystery of death, an effort to impose a sense of order and predictability on the perceived chaos of oblivion. The magnificent pyramids of Giza, therefore, were not just monuments to the perceived power and divinity of individual kings. They were also, in a broader sense, enduring monuments to an entire society's collective, multi-generational effort to try and conquer death, or at the very least, to successfully navigate its many challenges and ensure a favorable outcome. This monumental labor, spanning millennia and involving vast resources, seems to have been fueled just as much by a deep-seated, culturally ingrained fear of ultimate failure and the horror of annihilation, as it was by a hopeful and cherished vision of an eternal paradise in the field of reeds. For the ancient Egyptians, hope and fear were perhaps two inseparable sides of the same ancient, well-worn coin they carried towards eternity. The Egyptian vision of immortality, as we have seen throughout our sleepy journey, was certainly not a simple or automatically guaranteed affair. It was instead a complex, conditional, and rather fragile state, requiring the meticulous preservation of the physical body, the perpetuation of the name, and the successful reunification and sustenance of the soul's various spiritual components. It further necessitated ongoing maintenance in the afterlife through a continuous stream of offerings and the correct performance of rituals by the living, and it required constant vigilance and protection from a multitude of potential threats, both physical and metaphysical, often through the use of potent spells, amulets, and of course, curses. It was in essence a delicate and arduously sought form of immortality that they desperately and ingeniously tried to secure against all conceivable odds. So, as we picture in our minds the glittering gold of Tutankhamun's famous mask, the intricate and colorful hieroglyphs that cover countless temple and tomb walls, and the awe-inspiring monumental architecture that still inspires wonder and baffles engineers today, it's worth remembering what might lie quietly beneath all that undeniable ancient splendor. Underneath the gleaming gold and the precious lapis lazuli, underneath the powerful pronouncements of divine kingship and promised eternal life, there seems to beat a very relatable, very human heart. A heart that was anxious and uncertain about what truly comes after the end of our fleeting earthly existence. And within that anxiety, there was also a desperate, profound human desire to ensure that the next stage of being, whatever it might hold, was something positive, something meaningful, or at the very least, not the terrifying, absolute emptiness of oblivion. And perhaps now, as the shadows of our own day lengthen and our thoughts naturally turn towards rest and quietude, reflecting on these ancient anxieties so grandly and enduringly expressed can be a strangely comforting part of our sleepy journey through the annals of history. These grand, elaborate, and sometimes fearful expressions of a universal human desire for eternity are, after all, part of the long, slow, and often deeply repetitive story of humanity itself. They are echoes from a distant past, reminding us that across cultures and millennia we all grapple with trying to understand our fleeting place in the vastness of the universe, and we all contemplate in our own ways the quiet, enshrouding mystery of what lies beyond. As our sleepy exploration of ancient Egyptian afterlife anxieties and their intricate system of magical protections, including the fascinating world of tomb curses, begins to gently wind down for tonight, a natural question may surface in our quiet thoughts. Was this profound concern for the fate of the soul after death, this elaborate and costly effort to secure a positive eternity and to guard against all manner of misfortune in the afterlife, a phenomenon entirely unique to the ancient inhabitants of the land of the Nile? Or, perhaps, does it echo deeper, more universal human responses to the great, enduring mystery of what lies beyond our earthly existence? Indeed, when we cast our gaze, however briefly, across the wider historical landscape of other ancient civilizations that flourished around the Mediterranean and in the Near East, we find that while the specific details of their beliefs, the names and natures of the deities invoked, and the envisioned landscapes of their respective afterlives often differed greatly from those of Egypt, the underlying thread of anxiety regarding death, the uncertain fate of the soul, and the perceived need for proper funerary practices and some form of protection or appeasement for the deceased is a remarkably common, almost universal human experience. The ancient Egyptians, in their own distinctive and highly elaborate way, were clearly grappling with fundamental questions and deep-seated fears that were shared by many peoples across the ancient world. Let us allow our thoughts to drift for a moment eastward, to ancient Mesopotamia, the fertile land nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, home to the remarkable civilizations of the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. Their collective vision of the afterlife, often referred to in their texts by names such as Kur or Irkalla, was generally far gloomier and decidedly more pessimistic than the potential paradise offered to justified souls in the Egyptian field of reeds. For most Mesopotamians, it seems, the underworld was conceived as a shadowy, dusty, and rather desolate land of no return. A place where all the dead, largely regardless of their earthly deeds or moral standing, were believed to reside together in a significantly diminished and joyless state of being. In this rather bleak Mesopotamian underworld, the deceased were thought to exist as itemu, or spirits, subsisting on a meager diet of dust and clay, dwelling in darkness with little hope of relief or joy. The quality of one's existence there, as depicted in their literature, seemed to depend less on a moral judgment of one's life, as was so central to Egyptian belief, and more upon whether one had received a proper and complete burial by their surviving family, and, crucially, whether one continued to be remembered and ritually sustained by food and drink offerings from their living descendants. Without these essential attentions from the world of the living, the spirit faced a truly miserable, forgotten, and potentially dangerous eternity. This particular belief system naturally led to a different primary focus of afterlife anxiety in Mesopotamia. It was centered perhaps less on an individual's efforts to achieve a blissful personal paradise through righteous living and magical knowledge, and more on ensuring the proper performance of burial rites and the continuity of ancestral cults by the living. This was vital to avoid an utterly wretched state for the deceased and also, importantly, to prevent the neglected dead from becoming malevolent influences upon the living. If funerary rites were overlooked, or if the essential offerings, known in Akkadian as kispu, ceased to be provided, It was widely feared that the spirit of the deceased might become a troublesome, restless, and potentially harmful wandering ghost, a gridim, that could return to haunt its negligent family and bring misfortune, illness, or other troubles into their lives. Thus, protective measures in Mesopotamian society were often aimed more at appeasing the potentially dangerous spirits of the dead and ensuring they remained peacefully at rest in the underworld, rather than involving elaborate magical defenses of the tomb itself in the distinctive Egyptian style. Now, let our thoughts drift gently westward, across the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, to the intellectually vibrant world of the ancient Greeks. Their diverse conceptions of the afterlife also present some interesting parallels and notable contrasts with those of ancient Egypt. For the vast majority of souls in Greek belief, death meant an unavoidable journey, often across the mythical river Styx, to the realm of the god Hades. This underworld kingdom, also often called Hades after its ruler, was typically portrayed in their myths and literature as a shadowy, rather neutral and somewhat gloomy place of indefinite waiting for most souls. It was not generally conceived as a place of active torment for the average person, but neither was it imagined as one of great joy, reward, or vibrant activity. For most, it was a kind of misty, enervated, and perhaps monotonous existence, as a shade or phantom. The ancient Greeks did, however, possess a concept of differentiation in the afterlife based on earthly actions, but it was perhaps less systematized and universally applied than the detailed Egyptian model culminating in the weighing of the heart. For truly egregious sinners, especially those mythical figures who had directly offended the Olympian gods in significant ways, such as Sisyphus, Tantalus, or Ixion, there existed the dark pit of Tartarus, described as a place of specific, eternal, and often graphically depicted punishment. And conversely, for exceptional heroes, demigods, or those individuals deemed extraordinarily virtuous or favored by the gods, there existed the possibility of reaching the Elysian Fields, or the Isles of the Blessed, usually depicted as beautiful, peaceful, and idyllic realms. However, this blissful state was typically reserved for a very select few, and was not the general expectation or attainable goal for the average person, in the same way that the Egyptian Field of Reeds was a potential destination for any morally justified Egyptian. For the ancient Greeks, much like for the Mesopotamians and Egyptians, the meticulous performance of proper funerary rites was considered to be of paramount importance for the deceased soul's peaceful transition and subsequent rest in the realm of Hades. These complex rituals, which often included the prethesis, the ceremonial laying out of the body, the ekphora, the funeral procession to the grave, the act of burial or cremation itself, and the subsequent offering of libations and food at the tomb on prescribed days, were considered essential duties of the living. Neglect of these sacred obligations was viewed as a serious impiety and was widely believed to leave the soul restless, unable to properly enter the realm of the dead, and potentially lost or suffering between worlds. The god Hermes, in his specific role as Psychopompus, was often invoked as the gentle escorter of souls to their final destination. While elaborate inscribed tomb curses in the explicit, threatening style commonly found in Egypt were generally less typical in ancient Greece, a profound respect for graves and the memory of the dead was nonetheless a significant societal value. Grave stelae, often beautifully carved with depictions of the deceased and inscriptions of their name and lineage, served to mark the burial spot and commemorate their life. There was a general cultural understanding that tombs were sacrosanct and should not be disturbed. Furthermore, there existed a distinct fear of angering the spirits of the dead or incurring a form of spiritual pollution known as miasma through improper actions related to death, burial, or the neglect of tombs. Protective elements in Greek funerary practice, thus, often centered more on respecting established boundaries, performing ancestral dues correctly, and avoiding ritual contamination, rather than on inscribing active magical threats upon the tomb itself. Moving further westward in our thoughts to ancient Rome, we find a belief system concerning death and the afterlife that initially borrowed heavily from these established Greek conceptions, with Roman deities like Orcus or Dispater often corresponding to the Greek god Hades. The Romans, too, emphasized the critical importance of proper burial rites for the peace of the departed soul and the continuing veneration of ancestors by their descendants. The collective spirits of the deceased family members, known as the daimones, were considered divine and required regular respect, remembrance, and offerings from their living relatives to ensure their continued benevolence and peaceful repose in the afterlife. The Romans observed specific annual festivals such as the Parentalia, which was held in February, and the Lemuria, which took place in May, both of which were dedicated to appeasing and honoring the spirits of the dead. During the Parentalia, Families would make pilgrimages to their ancestral tombs, bringing offerings of food, wine, and flowers, and sharing a communal meal in honor of the departed. The Lemuria, by contrast, involved more private, household rituals aimed at exorcising or placating potentially malevolent or restless wandering spirits, known as larvae or lemures, who might not have received proper burial rites or who were otherwise unhappily lingering among the living. Again, a primary focus was on maintaining a harmonious and respectful relationship between the world of the living and the realm of the dead through acts of remembrance and ritual appeasement. Interestingly, the Romans made extensive and well-documented use of what are known to scholars as deficciones, or more commonly, curse tablets. These were typically small, thin sheets of lead or other pliable metals, upon which were inscribed curses calling for harm, misfortune, or restraint upon rivals in various aspects of life such as love affairs, business dealings, legal disputes, or even chariot races. While these fascinating objects clearly demonstrate a strong and widespread belief in the efficacy of directed harmful magic and the power of written curses within Roman society, they were most commonly employed in the context of everyday interpersonal conflicts and competitions. They were not by and large a standard or primary feature for routine tomb protection in the same explicit and prominent way that Egyptian curses sometimes were, although some Roman deficciones have indeed been discovered that do target individuals who might dare to disturb a grave or disrespect its occupant. Looking across these diverse ancient cultures, the Egyptians with their elaborate paradise and terrifying second death, the Mesopotamians with their gloomy land of no return, the Greeks with their shadowy Hades and exclusive Elysium, and the Romans with their emphasis on ancestral spirits and contractual curses, it becomes quite evident that while the specific details of their envisioned afterlives, the particular nature of their gods and spirits, and the precise forms of their rituals often differed quite significantly, a common thread of anxiety frequently runs through their beliefs about what happens after death. There was a widely shared fear of an unhappy, diminished, or tormented existence after death, a profound dread of oblivion or being entirely forgotten by the living, and a persistent concern that the spirits of the dead, if not properly cared for or if angered, could become malevolent and bring trouble to the world of the living. Consequently, the pervasive desire to use specific, culturally sanctioned rituals to provide regular and appropriate offerings to create lasting commemorative inscriptions which could, in some cultures like Egypt, explicitly include warnings or curses where deemed necessary, and the nearly universal practice of proper and respectful burial all served as common human responses aimed at mitigating these widespread and deeply. These varied practices were generally intended to ensure the deceased's safe and peaceful passage to the next world, their tranquil rest once there, their continued remembrance by those left behind, and ultimately, to protect the living from any potential negative repercussions emanating from the often mysterious and feared realm of the dead. Each culture, in its own way, developed its own unique and complex toolkit for attempting to deal with these fundamental human anxieties surrounding mortality. It is important for us to acknowledge, however, that while these underlying fears and the general human impulse towards creating protective funerary practices were indeed common across many ancient societies, the sheer, unparalleled scale of investment, the incredible theological and ritual complexity, and the vast societal resources that were consistently dedicated by the ancient Egyptians to their afterlife preparations were arguably unique in their extraordinary detail, their stunning artistic expression, and their remarkable continuity and consistency over several millennia. The uniquely Egyptian and highly elaborate process of mummification, the construction of truly monumental tombs ranging from early mastabas to the colossal pyramids and the hidden royal tombs of Thebes, the incredibly detailed and personalized religious texts known as the Books of the Dead, and the specific forms of their often potent tomb curses, taken together, represent a distinctly Egyptian elaboration on these otherwise universal human themes of death and remembrance. One might naturally wonder why the ancient Egyptian emphasis on these matters was so particularly pronounced, so elaborate, and so enduring throughout their long history. Perhaps the unique and relatively stable environment of the Nile Valley, with its predictable and life-giving annual cycle of inundation, fertile growth, and subsequent harvest, fostered a deep-seated cultural belief in the inherent possibility of cyclical rebirth and eternal renewal, a belief which then logically demanded correspondingly elaborate and enduring preparations for that renewed existence. Perhaps, too, the long periods of having a strong, centralized state, particularly during eras like the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom, meant that the society was able to effectively mobilize the vast labor and considerable resources necessary for such grand funerary projects. and for the development and dissemination of sophisticated religious doctrines concerning the afterlife, it is plausible that their specific physical environment and their particular societal structure profoundly shaped their unique and intensive response to these universal human anxieties about what lies beyond. Ultimately, looking beyond the Nile Valley at these varied ancient beliefs and practices concerning death and the afterlife serves to powerfully remind us of a deeply ingrained and truly universal human quest. It is a timeless quest to find meaning, order, and coherence in the face of our own inevitable mortality. It is a quest to seek some form of reassurance, however culturally constructed, about what might lie beyond the impenetrable veil of death. And it is a quest to try and exert some small measure of control, understanding, or preparedness over that ultimate and perhaps most profound of all human unknowns. The specific anxieties surrounding death were widely shared by our ancient ancestors across many cultures, even if the particular rituals, the detailed myths, and the magical or religious solutions they developed to cope with those anxieties differed significantly from one civilization to another. And so, as our sleepy journey through these ancient concerns and their various cultural expressions now comes to a gentle and quiet close for the night, perhaps there is a quiet comfort to be found in recognizing this shared human thread that connects us across the vast expanses of time and culture. The ancient Egyptians, with their elaborate tombs, their complex mythology, and their intricate curses were, in their own remarkable and enduring way, simply trying to navigate the same fundamental mysteries of life and death that have occupied human thoughts and shaped human societies for countless generations. Understanding their anxieties, and those of other ancient peoples who also gazed into the unknown, allows us to connect with a long, slow, and deeply human story. A story of resilience, hope, and fear that continues to unfold around us even as we ourselves drift towards our own quiet and needed rest. Okay, let us gently condense our thoughts as we draw this exploration to a close, focusing on how ancient Egyptian afterlife anxieties compare with those of their contemporaries. Chapter Beyond the Nile, Universal Afterlife Fears. As our quiet journey through ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs and their protective tomb curses concludes for now, we might ponder if their profound concern for the soul's eternal fate was entirely unique, or does this elaborate focus echo anxieties shared by other ancient peoples facing the same great mystery of what lies beyond our earthly lives. When we look to neighboring civilizations, we indeed find similar threads of human concern, though expressed in distinctly different cultural tapestries, revealing a common human response. Let our thoughts drift to ancient Mesopotamia, the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. Their vision of the afterlife, often called Kur or Irkela, was generally far more somber than Egypt's potential paradise. For most, the underworld was a shadowy, dusty land of no return, where all spirits, or etemu, subsisted on clay and dust in a dim, joyless realm, largely irrespective of their earthly morality. The quality of existence there depended heavily on proper burial and remembrance by the living. This Mesopotamian view fostered anxieties about being forgotten and the spirit becoming a malevolent gadim, a ghost that could trouble its negligent family. Thus, funerary practices and offerings, the kisfu, were vital not just for the deceased's meager comfort, but also to protect the living by keeping the dead peacefully at rest, a slightly different emphasis than the individual magical empowerment sought in many Egyptian tombs. But shifting to the ancient Greeks, their primary realm of the dead, Hades, was also typically a shadowy and neutral place for most souls, neither a place of great suffering nor of blissful reward. It was an enervated, ghostly existence, often lamented by heroic shades encountered in their epic literature as being far inferior to life on earth, however brief or difficult that life may have been. The Greeks did envision distinct fates for exceptional individuals. The dark pit of Tartarus awaited heinous sinners who had directly offended the gods, while the idyllic Elysian fields were reserved for a select few demigods, heroes, or exceptionally virtuous souls. However, unlike the Egyptian field of reeds, which was, in theory, attainable by any morally justified person through judgment and ritual, Elysium remained a far more exclusive and less universally anticipated destination. For the Greeks, the correct and meticulous performance of funerary rites, the prethys, or laying out of the body, the ekphora, or funeral procession, and the burial or cremation followed by libations, was of paramount importance. These rituals were deemed absolutely essential for the soul's peaceful transition to Hades, often guided by Hermes Psychopampos. Neglect could leave a soul tragically trapped between worlds, unable to find rest. Ancient Rome, in turn, inherited and adapted many Greek conceptions of the afterlife, with deities like Orcus or Dispater overseeing a similar underworld. A strong Roman emphasis was placed on the veneration of ancestral spirits, the daimones, who were considered divine and required ongoing respect and offerings from their living descendants to ensure their benevolence and the family's well-being. They created a strong bond of obligation between generations. Specific Roman festivals, like the Parentalia in February and the more apotropaic Lemuria in May, were dedicated to appeasing and honoring these spirits of the dead. The Parentalia involved families visiting tombs with offerings, reinforcing familial ties. The Lemuria focused on household rituals to placate any potentially restless or malevolent spirits, the larvae or lemures, ensuring they did not harm the living. While explicit inscribed tomb curses in the elaborate Egyptian style were less typical as a standard feature in Greek and Roman funerary practice, the sanctity of graves was nonetheless a significant value. Moreover, the Romans widely used defictiones, or curse tablets, in many aspects of daily life for disputes in love, business, or chariot races, demonstrating a strong societal belief in the power of directed magical execrations, even if not always tied to tombs. Across these diverse ancient cultures, despite varying details of their afterlife mythologies, certain common anxieties consistently surface. There was a widespread fear of a diminished, unhappy, or even tormented existence after death, a profound dread of oblivion or being utterly forgotten by the living, and a persistent concern that the spirits of the dead, if angered or neglected, could become malevolent forces, bringing misfortune to their descendants or community. Consequently, the earnest desire to employ specific, culturally sanctioned rituals, to provide regular and appropriate offerings of sustenance and remembrance, to create lasting commemorative inscriptions or monuments, and the almost universal cross-cultural practice of ensuring proper and respectful burial for the deceased, all clearly served as common and logical human responses aimed at mitigating these deeply felt and widely shared fears about mortality and the great unknown that lay beyond its threshold. It is important, however, to acknowledge that while these underlying fears and the general human impulse towards creating protective funerary practices were indeed common across many ancient societies, the sheer unparalleled scale of societal investment, the incredible theological and ritual complexity, and the vast material resources that were so consistently dedicated by the ancient Egyptians to their highly personalized afterlife preparations truly stand out in their extraordinary detail, their stunning artistic expression, and their remarkable continuity over several millennia. One might naturally ponder why the ancient Egyptian emphasis on these matters was so particularly pronounced and so enduring throughout their long and storied history. Perhaps the unique and relatively stable riverine environment of the Nile Valley, with its predictable and life-giving annual cycle of inundation, fertile growth, and subsequent harvest, fostered a deep-seated cultural belief in the inherent possibility of cyclical rebirth and eternal renewal for humans as well. A belief which then logically demanded correspondingly elaborate and enduring preparations to ensure that renewed existence was a positive one. Ultimately, looking beyond the Nile at these varied ancient beliefs and customs concerning death and the afterlife serves to powerfully remind us of a deeply ingrained and truly universal human quest. It is a timeless quest to find meaning, order, and some measure of reassurance in the face of our own inevitable mortality, to seek understanding about what might lie beyond the veil of death, and to try and exert some small measure of control or preparedness over that ultimate and perhaps most profound of all human unknown. Thus, as our sleepy contemplation of these ancient worlds and their diverse customs now draws to its gentle and quiet conclusion for this particular session, we can perhaps find a certain quiet solace, a sense of shared human experience in recognizing this enduring, connecting thread. The ancient Egyptians, with their truly magnificent efforts to secure eternity, were, in their own remarkable way, simply navigating the same fundamental human mysteries that continue to occupy our thoughts and shape our societies even today, as we too seek comfort and meaning in the quietude of the night. Okay, let us gently draw our lengthy discussion towards its conclusion for tonight by considering whether the profound afterlife anxieties and elaborate protective measures of ancient Egypt were unique, or if similar concerns echoed in other ancient civilizations. Chapter: Beyond the Nile, Universal Afterlife Fears. So as our tranquil journey through the shadowed landscapes of ancient Egyptian afterlife belief and their intricate methods of magical protection, most notably the tomb curses, now softly nears its end for this session of sleepy learning, a reflective question might gently surface in our minds. Was this pervasive, deeply ingrained cultural preoccupation with the soul's ultimate fate, this monumental and resource-intensive societal endeavor to secure a blessed eternity and to meticulously shield the deceased from every imaginable misfortune after physical death, a phenomenon entirely peculiar and exclusive to the ancient inhabitants of the sun-drenched fertile land of the Nile? Or, perhaps more plausibly, does this characteristically intense Egyptian focus on all matters concerning the afterlife instead resonate with even more profound, widely dispersed, and truly universal human responses to the great, overarching, and often deeply unsettling mystery of what precisely awaits us beyond the familiar threshold of our earthly existence? Indeed, when we allow our contemplative gaze to pan slowly across the broader historical and diverse cultural tapestry of other significant ancient civilizations that once flourished contemporaneously around the vital Mediterranean basin, and throughout the historically rich territories of the ancient Near East, we discover compelling and rather abundant archaeological and textual evidence which strongly suggests that this is very much the case. While the precise theological details of their distinct belief systems, the particular names, complex attributes, and intricate mythologies of the various deities invoked within their specific funerary contexts, and the often dramatically envisioned cosmological landscapes of their respective afterlives frequently differed quite substantially from those so elaborately and consistently developed over millennia in ancient Egypt, the underlying foundational thread of palpable human anxiety regarding the inescapable event of death, the uncertain ultimate fate of the disembodied human soul, and the perceived critical societal need for proper, respectful funerary practices, coupled with some ongoing form of spiritual protection or ritual appeasement for the deceased, reveals itself to be a remarkably common, almost universally present human experience across time and culture. Let our thoughts drift for a brief contemplative interlude towards ancient Mesopotamia, the historically rich and legendarily fertile crescent of land situated strategically between the Great Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This pivotal region was home to the remarkable successive and influential civilizations of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. Their collective vision of the afterlife, frequently referred to in their numerous surviving cuneiform texts by ancient and rather evocative names such as Ker or perhaps Irkalla, was generally portrayed in their rich literature as being considerably gloomier, more consistently shadowy in character, and decidedly more pessimistic in its overall prevailing outlook than the potential sunlit, blissful paradise that was offered to justified and ritually prepared souls in the Egyptian field of reeds. It was often grimly and resignedly termed the land of no return, a final, unavoidable destination for all mortals. For the vast majority of ancient Mesopotamians, it strongly appears from their surviving textual and archaeological records, this rather bleak and ultimately uninviting underworld was primarily conceived as an extensive, subterranean realm characterized by pervasive, choking dust, deep and unending primordial darkness, and a profound, echoing, and somewhat unnerving silence. It was widely understood to be a place where all the departed dead, largely irrespective of their specific earthly deeds, their accumulated wealth, or their individual moral standing acquired during their lifetimes, were believed to reside together indefinitely in a significantly diminished, inherently weak, and ultimately joyless state of perpetual shadowy being. The deceased within this Mesopotamian netherworld were thought to exist as etamu, essentially insubstantial, shadowy spirits or ghosts, subsisting miserably on a meager and unappetizing diet consisting of nothing but dry dust and lifeless clay. They experienced little to no comforting or illuminating light, and they found no real solace, joy, or lasting comfort within the dreary, unchanging confines of their shadowy, eternally subterranean domain. The quality of one's ongoing, monotonous existence there seemed to depend less critically on a divine moral judgment of one's past life, a concept that was so pivotally central to the sophisticated and highly developed ancient Egyptian belief system, and significantly more upon whether one had actually received a complete, correct, and ritually proper burial performed with due diligence and respect by their surviving family members. Crucially, this afterlife condition also depended very heavily and continuously on whether one continued to be respectfully remembered and ritually sustained by specific, vital offerings of food and drink, known in the Akkadian language as kispu. These offerings were expected to be diligently and regularly provided by living descendants at prescribed, religiously significant intervals throughout the year. Without these absolutely essential attentions and provisions generously supplied from the world of the living, the departed spirit faced a truly miserable, utterly forgotten, and potentially quite dangerous eternal existence. possibly even fading into complete nothingness. This Mesopotamian belief system naturally fostered its own distinct kind of afterlife anxiety. This anxiety was focused perhaps less on an individual's personal, arduous, and lifelong striving to achieve a blissful, activity-filled paradise through the cultivation of exceptionally righteous living and the acquisition of esoteric magical knowledge, as was often the case in ancient Egypt, for those who could afford such preparations. Instead, Mesopotamian anxiety was more pointedly and pragmatically directed towards ensuring the correct and perpetual performance of crucial burial rites by others, and guaranteeing the unwavering continuity of ancestral cults by those who remained among the living. This ongoing care by descendants was considered absolutely vital, not only to avoid an utterly wretched and diminished state for the deceased persons themselves, but also, significantly, to prevent the potentially dangerous, neglected, or angered dead from becoming actively malevolent spiritual influences upon the living members of their lineage or their wider community. If these crucial funerary rites were unfortunately overlooked by the family, performed incorrectly or incompletely, or if the essential ancestral offerings of Kispu ceased to be provided for any particular reason over time, it was widely and genuinely feared by the neglected deceased individual might consequently transform into a troublesome, restless, and potentially harmful wandering ghost. Known in their rich language as Ajidim, such a malevolent spiritual entity could, it was commonly believed, find its way back from the desolate underworld to actively haunt its negligent family, bringing with it various forms of disruptive misfortune, unexplained and persistent illness, destructive familial strife, or other significant and unwelcome troubles into their daily lives. Protective measures were therefore key. Now let our contemplative thoughts drift gently westward for a moment, across the historic and culturally significant waters of the Mediterranean Sea, towards the intellectually vibrant and artistically rich world of the ancient Greeks. Their diverse and continually evolving conceptions of the afterlife also present us with some illuminating parallels and several notable contrasts when carefully compared with those beliefs that were prevalent in ancient Egypt. For the vast majority of human souls in mainstream ancient Greek belief, the inevitable event of death signified an unavoidable and somewhat sorrowful journey, often depicted in their mythology as occurring across the mythical, shadowy river Styx, towards the subterranean realm ruled by the stern and aloof god Hades. This extensive underworld kingdom, also frequently referred to simply as Hades after its solemn and unyielding divine ruler, was typically portrayed as a predominantly shadowy realm. This common Greek underworld was not generally conceived by them as a place of active, fiery torment or specific targeted punishment for the average deceased person, but neither was it commonly imagined as one of significant joy, tangible reward, or vibrant, continued activity that was in any way akin to the cherished experiences of earthly life. For most ordinary individuals, it simply represented a kind of misty, enervated, and perhaps somewhat monotonous eternal existence, as a disembodied shade or a fleeting, insubstantial phantom, largely and often lamentably cut off from the warmth, the color, and the sheer vitality of the sunlit world of the living that they had irrevocably left behind. There was often in Greek literature a profound sense of regret and irreparable loss associated with this forfeiture. The ancient Greeks did, however, possess a clear and influential concept of some eventual differentiation in the ultimate fate of souls within their afterlife, based primarily upon their significant earthly actions and, importantly, their perceived relationship with the powerful and often capricious Olympian gods. For truly egregious sinners, especially those prominent mythical figures who had directly and heinously offended the gods, there existed the dark, inescapable, and truly terrible pit of Tartarus, consistently described in their ancient texts as a specific place of unending, divinely ordained, and often graphically depicted eternal punishment. Conversely, for exceptionally renowned heroes or those deemed extraordinarily virtuous, the idyllic Elysian fields offered a blissful, peaceful, eternal existence, though this was a rare honor. For the ancient Greeks, much like for their Mesopotamian and Egyptian contemporaries, the meticulous and ritually correct performance of proper funerary rites was considered to be of absolutely paramount importance for the deceased soul's peaceful and successful transition to, and its subsequent untroubled and lasting rest within, the shadowy realm of the god Hades. These complex rituals, including the prethesses, laying out of the body, the ekphora, funeral procession, burial or cremation, and subsequent libations and food offerings at the tomb, were all essential duties. Neglect was viewed as a grave impiety, believed to leave the soul restless and unable to properly enter the realm of the dead, potentially lost between worlds. Looking broadly across these diverse ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Greek, and Roman, It becomes undeniably evident that while the specific theological details of their envisioned afterlives and the precise forms of their rituals often differed quite significantly, a common underlying thread of profound human anxiety frequently runs through their collective beliefs and established practices concerning what happens after physical death. There was a widely shared fear of an unhappy existence after death, a dread of oblivion or being forgotten, and a concern that spirits of the dead, if not properly cared for, could become malevolent. Thus, as our sleepy contemplation of these ancient worlds and their diverse customs now draws to its gentle and quiet conclusion for this particular session, we can perhaps find a certain quiet solace, a sense of shared human experience, in recognizing this enduring, connecting thread. The ancient Egyptians, with their truly magnificent efforts to secure eternity, were, in their own remarkable way, simply navigating the same fundamental human mysteries of life, death, and what may lie beyond, mysteries that have occupied human thoughts and shaped human societies for countless generations, and which continue to resonate even as we ourselves drift towards our own quiet and needed rest. Okay, as our journey through the ancient Egyptian engagement with mortality and the afterlife nears its gentle conclusion for this evening, let us consider how their deep-seated anxieties might still find echoes in our own contemporary world. Chapter: Modern Echoes Still Anxious About Death. We have wandered through the elaborate beliefs, the profound and often palpable anxieties, and the intricate, sometimes magical protective measures that so uniquely characterized the ancient Egyptian approach to death and to what they believed lay beyond its shadowed veil. Their world, filled with iconic pyramids, mystifying mummification practices, potent sacred spells, and occasionally fearsome tomb curses, might initially seem incredibly distant from our own, a fascinating but perhaps unrelatable relic of a long-vanished historical era. Yet, as we now prepare to conclude our sleepy exploration for tonight, it is perhaps both worthwhile and illuminating to pause for a moment and gently consider a rather reflective question. How much, in truly fundamental human terms, has genuinely changed over the many intervening millennia? Do we in our modern, technologically advanced, and globally interconnected society still unknowingly and perhaps unconsciously echo some of those same ancient, deeply felt anxieties when we individually and collectively contemplate our own mortality and whatever, if anything, may ultimately follow our time on this earth? The ultimate, perhaps unanswerable, mystery of death, of what precisely happens when our conscious earthly existence finally ceases, remains as profound, as deeply personal, and often as unsettling for many of us today as it undoubtedly was for the ancient inhabitants of the fertile Nile Valley thousands upon thousands of years ago. While our contemporary scientific understanding of intricate biological processes and the physical universe has certainly advanced immeasurably since their time, the fundamental existential questions remain. These enduring questions concerning the nature and persistence of consciousness, the meaning and potential endurance of individual legacy, and the deeply personal, often unspoken, consideration of the potential for some form of continued existence or utter, final oblivion, continue to provoke profound human contemplation. They shape diverse personal beliefs and philosophical outlooks, and sometimes, inevitably, they generate a quiet, persistent undercurrent of existential unease, an emotional state not entirely dissimilar in its essential spirit to that experienced by our distant Egyptian human ancestors. Consider for a brief moment the almost obsessive ancient Egyptian cultural focus on ensuring that their personal name, their Ren, which they firmly and consistently believed was an absolutely essential spiritual component of their individual identity and their eternal being, would live on indefinitely. They sought for it to be meticulously inscribed on magnificent stone monuments and respectfully remembered through the perpetual, dutiful performance of offerings by their descendants for generations to come. This was a core tenet of their preparations. Is this ancient preoccupation not mirrored, in many significant and recognizable ways, by our own common modern concerns about the kind of legacy we ourselves will ultimately leave behind for those who follow us? We too ponder, often quite deeply and at various stages of our lives, how exactly we will be remembered, perhaps through our notable professional achievements and lasting societal contributions, our diverse creative or artistic works, the positive and enduring impact we earnestly hope we have made on our families and wider communities, or simply the cherished personal reputation we aim to leave behind us when we depart. The ancient Egyptians, as we have discussed at length throughout our journey, painstakingly filled their often elaborate and costly tombs with what they considered to be absolutely essential provisions and their most cherished earthly possessions. These myriad items were all intended to magically sustain their ka, their vital life force, and to provide necessary comfort, status, and reassuring familiarity for their ba, their mobile personality aspect, throughout their long and challenging journey in the afterlife. They deeply and understandably feared the desolate prospect of a destitute or unequipped eternity. Do we not also, in our own culturally specific and legally structured ways, exhibit a strong and often meticulous desire to protect our own accumulated possessions and to ensure their thoughtful and fair distribution after our own passing? Modern legal instruments such as precisely drafted wills, sometimes complex family trusts designed to manage assets across several generations, and even the increasingly necessary and often quite intricate practice of digital estate planning for our valuable online accounts and intangible digital assets, while vastly different in their specific form and legalistic mechanism from ancient Egyptian grave goods, surely stem from a similar fundamental human impulse. The truly formidable and highly dramatic weighing of the heart ceremony, an absolutely central tenet in the Egyptian conception of the Duat or underworld, where a lifetime's accumulated deeds were to be meticulously and divinely judged by the great god Osiris against the single delicate feather of Ma'at, representing truth, balance, and cosmic order, clearly represented a profound cultural fear of an ultimate moral reckoning and its potentially devastating eternal consequences. This was a pivotal moment for every soul. This powerful and enduring concept of a final, unavoidable judgment, where one's actions and true intentions are meticulously assessed and one's ultimate eternal fate is consequently and irrevocably determined, continues to resonate powerfully and significantly within the foundational frameworks of many major modern religious traditions all around the globe. Enduring and widespread beliefs in some form of divine judgment, a future heavenly paradise for the righteous, a place of punishment or necessary purification for unrepentant transgressors, or more abstract philosophical concepts such as karma, all reflect an abiding and deeply human understanding that our moral choices made during life are indeed significant. Even beyond explicitly or traditionally religious frameworks, the intrinsic and often unspoken fear of judgment frequently persists in more secular or societal forms in our contemporary world. We might find ourselves concerned, for example, about how future historians will ultimately judge our collective actions as a society, how our individual societal contributions, or perhaps our perceived lack thereof, will be evaluated by posterity, or what the lasting impact of our lives, both public and private, will be perceived to be by those who come after us and inherit the world we inevitably leave behind. The ancient Egyptian horror of complete and utter oblivion, the truly terrifying prospect of their uniquely personal and magically potent name being deliberately erased from monuments by their enemies or simply forgotten over the course of time by indifferent or absent descendants, a fate which they directly equated with a kind of dreaded second and final spiritual death, was undeniably a primary driving force behind many of their most elaborate, resource-intensive, and culturally significant funerary practices. This was a fear to be countered at all costs. This deep-seated and culturally pervasive fear of being utterly forgotten by the living, of simply vanishing from collective memory without leaving any discernible or lasting trace of one's existence, surely finds its direct and poignant parallel in the common modern human desire for some form of enduring and meaningful remembrance by those who survive us. We generally seek to live on, at least for a cherished period of time, in the warm and affectionate memories of our loved ones, through the personal stories and fond anecdotes that are told about us long after we are gone. Consider also our own often quite elaborate and sometimes considerably expensive modern funeral practices and diverse memorial traditions, whether these involve traditional burial in a consecrated cemetery with a formal service, the increasingly common practice of cremation followed by the symbolic scattering or respectful interment of ashes in a personally meaningful location, carefully planned and personalized memorial services filled with evocative music and heartfelt eulogies delivered by friends and family, traditional wakes or extended visitations where family and friends gather to mourn and provide mutual support, or the thoughtful crafting of detailed obituaries published in newspapers or shared widely online. These varied customs, though differing greatly across diverse cultures and individual personal beliefs, still serve absolutely crucial social, emotional, and psychological functions for the bereaved community. The diverse ways in which we actively choose to memorialize the departed in contemporary society also find clear and resonant echoes in ancient practices, albeit now often employing modern technological tools alongside more traditional methods of remembrance and enduring commemoration, engraved headstones and personalized plaques in cemeteries and peaceful memorial gardens. grand public monuments dedicated to notable historical individuals or significant collective sacrifices, increasingly popular online memorial websites and curated social media tribute pages where memories, photographs, and condolences can be shared globally and instantaneously. The establishment of prestigious named university chairs in academic fields or significant charitable foundations in someone's lasting honor, all these varied modern forms of public and private remembrance ultimately serve a very similar core human function. While the ancient Egyptians harbored very specific and detailed anxieties about the potentially perilous journey their souls would have to undertake through the dangerous mythological landscape of Duat and the numerous difficult challenges they would undoubtedly face in the complex and critical process of the afterlife judgment before the divine tribunal of Osiris, many common modern anxieties surrounding the topic of death tend to focus perhaps more intensely and immediately on the actual physical, emotional, and often highly medicalized process of dying itself. Widespread contemporary concerns about potential physical pain, the possibility of prolonged suffering during serious illness, the perceived loss of personal dignity during terminal stages of life, the often bewildering and overwhelming complexities of modern medical interventions and difficult end-of-life care decisions, and the significant emotional and practical burden that a long or difficult illness might unfortunately place on beloved family members, are frequently at the forefront of contemporary fears when contemplating the end of life. The profound ancient Egyptian desire to meticulously provide for their Ka spirit and their Ba personality in the afterlife, diligently ensuring that these essential spiritual aspects of their being had all they would conceivably need for a successful and comfortable eternity, can also be seen as being clearly reflected in a common modern desire to protect our loved ones as much as possible from the potential practical, financial, and emotional burdens that our own eventual death might regrettably impose upon them. The careful and thoughtful arrangement of comprehensive life insurance policies designed to provide ongoing financial security for dependents, the increasingly common practice of pre-planning and often prepaying for one's own funeral expenses to ease later decisions and financial burdens for grieving family members, and the meticulous organization of personal, legal, and financial affairs to prevent future confusion or dispute. These sensible modern actions, while appearing entirely pragmatic and rational on the surface, also very often stem from a deep, caring, and inherently protective human impulse. Our increasingly pervasive and deeply interconnected digital age has also introduced entirely new and remarkably complex dimensions to human existence and, consequently, to what might now constitute an afterlife of sorts, at least in terms of the persistence of personal information and digital memory. Our accumulated and often vast digital footprints, our extensive social media profiles built up over many years of sharing, our vast archives of online communications through email and myriad messaging apps, our stored personal data across numerous diverse online platforms and amorphous cloud services collectively create a kind of persistent, disembodied virtual identity that can potentially outlive our physical selves by many years, or perhaps even indefinitely into the future. And while the ancient Egyptians specifically feared powerful supernatural curses that could be magically activated by the unauthorized violation of their sacred tombs, perhaps one could reasonably argue that modern society possesses its own distinctive forms of potent, socially enacted curses that can bring about a kind of devastating social, professional, or reputational death long before any physical death occurs. The swift and often widespread destruction of an individual's public reputation through pervasive online shaming, or what is sometimes controversially termed cancel culture, the lasting, indelible stigma often associated with a major public scandal or a significant moral transgression, or the unforgiving mark of a widely publicized personal or professional failure, can certainly feel to the individual involved like a kind of profound social annihilation. So when we pause to pose the reflective and rather searching question, how much has really truly changed in its fundamental essence since ancient Egyptian times regarding our complex human relationship with mortality and its inevitable aftermath? The answer is, of course, necessarily complex, nuanced, and multifaceted. Our current scientific knowledge, our impressive technological capabilities, and our medical practices have transformed yet many fundamental human responses to death. The fear of the unknown, the hope for remembrance, the desire for meaning, seem remarkably enduring across the millennia. Therefore, as we allow our minds to gently settle and our thoughts to gradually quieten for the night, it can be a strangely soothing and perhaps even unifying experience to recognize these timeless human concerns, so clearly mirrored in the elaborate beliefs and monumental efforts of a civilization from so very long ago. The ancient Egyptians, with their grand tombs, their meticulous mummies, and their magical curses, were, in their own culturally specific and endlessly fascinating way, simply wrestling with the same profound and often perplexing questions about life, death, and legacy that continue to occupy human hearts and challenge human minds in every generation, right up to our present day, inviting not fear, but perhaps a peaceful, sleepy perspective. As the quiet moments of our evening deepen, drawing us ever closer to rest, we will gently bring our sleepy journey through the fascinating and often anxious world of ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs and their intricate magical defenses to its soft and reflective close for tonight. Chapter concluding reflection, the enduring fear. We have wandered in our softly focused thoughts beside the truly colossal pyramids, those enduring monuments to an unwavering and powerful belief in an existence that continues far beyond this transient earthly one. We have also glimpsed the almost unbelievable meticulous care that was taken in the complex art of mummification, a sacred process dedicated to preserving the fragile, physical human form for what they hoped would be an eternity of continued being. On the immediate surface, this vast and conspicuous expenditure of societal effort, the often dazzling displays of gold and precious materials found within the tombs, the intricate and sophisticated artistry evident in every facet of their funerary culture, and the sheer, undeniable grandeur of their preparations for death, might understandably speak to us of an unshakable, almost supreme confidence, a bold and unwavering assertion of absolute certainty in the face of life's ultimate mystery. Yet, as we have gently explored together throughout our shared journey this evening, if we allow ourselves to carefully and quietly peel back these impressive outer layers of magnificent material preparation and seemingly bold theological assertion, we often find not just unblemished and unwavering assurance, but also the subtle, persistent, and deeply resonant echoes of a profound and fundamentally human vulnerability, a quiet anxiety that seems to underpin so much of their elaborate system. There was, it seems quite clear from their texts and practices, a palpable and ever-present fear of complete and utter oblivion. There was a persistent dread that one's precious personal name, the Ren, which they considered so absolutely essential for individual identity and continued existence, might somehow be erased from memory or from monuments. Or, equally terrifyingly, that the preserved physical body, the vital earthly anchor required for the spiritual Ka and Ba, might be lost, desecrated, or destroyed, thereby leading to a horrifying cessation of individual being, a true non-existence. The truly formidable and highly dramatized ordeal of the weighing of the heart ceremony, wherein a lifetime's accumulated deeds and intentions were to be meticulously and divinely judged against the single delicate feather of Ma'at, the personification of truth and cosmic order, reveals an acute and understandable societal anxiety about ultimate moral accountability. It underscores the terrifying potential consequences of an unfavorable divine verdict, which could lead not to paradise but to final destruction. The imagined perilous journey that the deceased soul had to undertake through the shadowy and dangerous landscape of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was certainly not envisioned as a peaceful or straightforward passage. Instead, it was consistently portrayed as being fraught with numerous potential dangers, encounters with monstrous, hostile demons, challenges from stern, unyielding supernatural gatekeepers, and the navigation of confusing, labyrinthine paths, where an unprepared or unwary soul could easily go astray and become lost for all eternity. Their famously elaborate religious texts, known collectively to us as the Books of the Dead, filled as they are with potent spells, crucial passwords, and detailed otherworldly maps, were therefore not merely confident or optimistic travel guides for the deceased. Rather, they should perhaps be understood as meticulously assembled and highly valued magical toolkits, born directly from the pressing and pervasive anxiety of successfully navigating these many unseen perils and arriving safely at the final judgment. The vast quantities of diverse tomb goods, ranging from simple loaves of daily bread and jars of beer to sumptuously decorated royal chariots and intricate board games, represented far more than just provisions for ensuring a comfortable or leisurely existence in the afterlife. They were, in a very real sense for the Egyptians, absolutely essential supplies, placed there out of a deep fear of an unprovided, diminished, and ultimately unsustainable existence in the world beyond this one. And the tomb curses themselves, which we have discussed at length with their often dire and very specific threats invoking divine wrath and terrible misfortunes upon any transgressor, stand as exceptionally potent and enduring testaments to this same underlying insecurity. They were conceived as the ultimate magical shield, a final line of defense against a multitude of perceived earthly and potentially supernatural threats to the tomb and its occupant. What gradually emerges from a holistic consideration of all these elements is a remarkably detailed picture of an incredibly sophisticated, multi-layered, and comprehensive defense system. This system appears to have been meticulously constructed not primarily from a place of absolute, unshakable certainty and a guaranteed outcome, but rather from a place of profound human vulnerability and a deeply felt, desperate desire to exert some measure of control over the ultimately uncontrollable and unknowable aspects of death and eternity. This monumental and uniquely Egyptian focus on death, therefore, was perhaps less about an arrogant or defiant stance against the inevitability of mortality, and much more about a deeply human, though uniquely and magnificently expressed, collective societal response to the universal anxieties and profound questions that the reality of mortality inevitably brings to every culture, in every historical age. Their concerns were, at heart, our concerns. Their specific and often vividly expressed anxieties, the persistent fear of being completely forgotten by the living, the understandable dread of facing a final and unforgiving judgment, the ongoing concern for the well-being and integrity of their essential spiritual essence, the pressing need to protect their hard-won legacy and good name from slander or erasure. These ancient fears are not, when we reflect upon them quietly, so entirely alien or distant from our own modern human sensibilities, are they? We too, in our own contemporary and culturally specific ways, often seek lasting remembrance from those we leave behind. We too grapple both individually and collectively with complex questions of meaning, purpose, and value that extend beyond our finite lifespan. And we too endeavor to protect what we hold dear, what we have built, and who we are, even when facing the great, silent unknown that awaits every one of us eventually. Enduring and universal human quest to find solace in the face of loss, to assert some semblance of order and meaning against the backdrop of inevitable change, and to hope for some form of positive continuity or valued legacy in the face of death's profound mystery, serves as a quiet but powerful thread that connects our own introspective, sleepy reflections tonight with those of the ancient Egyptians who lived and worried so very long ago. Their magnificent and resource-intensive preparations for the afterlife and their equally potent and fiercely protective curses were in the end born from that same deep and ancient well of human feeling, an intricate and poignant blend of radiant hope and shadowed fear, of astonishing grandeur and touching vulnerability. These very human emotions continue to shape how individuals and societies across the globe approach the end of life and the questions it raises. And so, as we ourselves now drift gently towards the welcome embrace of sleep, perhaps we can view their ancient anxieties not with a sense of detachment or mere historical curiosity, but with a gentle, empathetic understanding. We can recognize in their elaborate, millennia-long dance with eternity a shared, timeless humanity, a dance that sought above all else to find some measure of peace and security, and to conquer, in whatever way they could conceive, the enduring human fear of the final darkness. And so our quiet exploration of ancient Egyptian afterlife anxieties, alongside their fascinatingly intricate curses, now gently reaches its final conclusion for this particular session. We extend our sincere gratitude for you joining us on this rather sleepy, deliberately meandering journey deep into the distant past, allowing these ancient whispers of history to accompany your moments of rest. It is our earnest hope that these recounted tales of grand monuments, of profound human fears concerning mortality, and of complex magical beliefs have perhaps provided a uniquely soothing backdrop for your relaxation. We trust it has been a gentle distraction from the modern day, possibly lulling your mind toward a state of deeper tranquility and peaceful repose as you've listened. If you have indeed found some measure of calm or quiet interest in our somewhat boring historical meanderings this evening, we would be immensely grateful if you would consider showing your appreciation by leaving a gentle like on this video. It truly helps our channel reach other sleepy historians who are seeking similar moments of peaceful, informative diversion. And of course, should you wish to embark upon further tranquil voyages into the curious, often overlooked corners of history, all designed specifically for relaxation and eventual slumber, please do consider subscribing to our channel. We have many more sleepy narratives planned. exploring the quietude found within bygone eras, presented for your restfulness. We would genuinely love to hear your own sleepy reflections in the comments section below. Do any of these ancient anxieties regarding death, enduring remembrance, or the pervasive unknown resonate with you personally? Or perhaps you have thoughts on other historical periods and their unique approaches to these universal human concerns. Please share. For this present moment, may the profound quietude of the past bring a deep serenity to your current experience. May your thoughtful mind find peaceful stillness, and may your impending rest be truly deep and wonderfully rejuvenating. Until our next quiet historical exploration together, we bid you sleep well, and may all your dreams be exceedingly gentle.